Welcome to Classic Trials. If you're new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we make sense of the law one bite at a time. In this series, we observe and analyze the play-by-play of some of the biggest trials that have shaped the public consciousness of the American judicial system. In this season, we're working our way through the case of California v. Erik and Lyle Menendez. Growing up in Princeton, New Jersey, and then Beverly Hills, California, these young men had everything they could ever want, or so it seemed, until one night on August 20th, 1989, they approached Jose and Kitty Menendez with newly purchased shotguns. Put on trial for murdering their own parents, they claimed self-defense, arguing they were terrorized in their own home by abusive parents until they could take no more. Which argument is more convincing? Come join and see for yourself. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a happy Monday to everyone. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. For those of us in the United States, or those of us who are operating off of an American calendar one way or another, it is a national holiday, so you might be off work, maybe not. Not all places give this day as a holiday for work, but regardless, we are here today. We're gonna proceed because we have a long way to go in this trial, even though we have come very, very far. So yeah, I hope you guys had a wonderful weekend. I hope it was restful, and I hope that you have a good start to this upcoming week. Hey, Andy Bear. Andy. Everybody needs to see you. There you go. Perfect. Indy Bear. There you go. Good girl. All righty. Okay, so just as last week, what we had last week was more testimony. Well, we had part one of the testimony of Dr. Ann Tyler. Today is part two. So we're going to be continuing on with that. Part of this is going to be testimony that she's going to be doing outside the presence of the jury, because there's going to be some questions about some of the stuff that the defense wants her to be able to testify to, which if you watched last week's episode 53 now, if you watched it with us, you may have remembered, or you may recognize that the defense really wanted to get into the prior abuse of Kitty in her childhood. So they wanted to do that because it's important to them, because of the idea that oftentimes abuse is cyclical. Oftentimes abuse can start to mirror abuse that happened from a previous generation. So this is one of the things that they are going to try to get into. And so they have to have some testimony outside the presence of the jury first. And that's what we're actually going to be starting with today. As a reminder from last week, some of the stuff that she testified to. In case you don't remember, I have to revisit my notes actually. So one of the big things that she testified about, and this is a very important witness for the defense for this exact reason, right? Because we need to establish, if you are the defense, we need to establish the idea that there was abuse, not just from, the testimony from the brothers, and then there's been corroboration by other family members about some of these other aspects and whatnot. And they're sort of they're pieces here and there that sort of hint to this overall global problem. But this witness here is very important because she's saying, no, I'm looking at all of these different behaviors and I'm seeing that all of this is classified as abuse. And what she focused on in episode 53 was, in fact, Kitty as opposed to Jose, which is very important for the defense, again, because of the fact that they killed both of their parents. It's pretty clear to anyone who has been following along, who believes the brothers to any extent, really. If you tend to believe the brothers more often than not about their history, about their past, whether you believe that they should be found guilty or not guilty, and then on various levels, right? There are all kinds of different agreements, disagreements that people have as to what should happen at the end of this trial, as to the legal questions involved. When it comes to the abuse, a lot of people do agree that Jose was an abuser and that he abused them in the worst ways. Not everyone believes that. Of course, not everyone does. I think a lot of the people who have been, most of the people, I would say, we've been polling at least this chat from the beginning as to this question about the abuse. Most people seem to believe that Jose did in fact abuse them in all the worst ways. So the question then comes to, what about Kitty? Does that actually get classified as abuse? In 1993, I think this testimony was even more important than it would be today. Although today it's still important as well. This is a much wider angle than it normally is. This is interesting. What's happening here? This is new. I just noticed that. It's usually like a much closer sort of frame, which is fine. But anyway, I'm sorry. I just noticed that. Anyway, focus back to what we're talking about. So anyway, so like I said, this is very, very, very important testimony here. And so at the very beginning of this portion of testimony that we have here today is argument in front of the judge outside the presence of the jury. So we're going to skip that. And then we're going to get right into the testimony outside the presence of the jury, where they're getting into the stuff about Kitty and her background and how that impacted her marriage with Jose and how, other stuff like that I think would be interesting for you guys. But we're going to skip. Then after that, there's going to be some more argument by all of the attorneys and for the judge. Of course, it's interesting. A lot of people will want to go and see that as well, but I want to keep it to testimony. So that's what we're gonna do is just limit it to testimony, whether it's in front of the jury or outside the jury or outside the presence of the jury. So okay, yeah. So let's get to it. So this, like I said, this first portion is going to be no jury present, talking about some of this other stuff to see if they can even get this admitted in front of the jury. And now, as always, friendly reminder for everybody, trigger warnings all around. This is tough stuff to watch because undoubtedly at some point she's here to talk about abuse, right? So all kinds of different kinds of abuse. So if that is difficult for you to watch, if that's difficult for you to listen to, for whatever reason, take care of yourself. Do whatever you need to do to take care of your mental health. No content is ever worth that. So, yeah. And then we'll be periodically pulling some chats from the mods onto the screen about trigger warnings and about, mental health resources, helplines, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. Anyway, and also, as always, any questions, let me know. If I don't pause right away to answer it, I'll be saving it and I'll answer it at a more convenient time. Okay, cool. All righty, let's get moving.
Change her opinion, but that the presence of it supports her.
All right. Yes.
Dr. Tyler, you're aware of the information concerning the abusive home life that Mary Louise Menendez came from?
I am.
What significance, if any, did you attach to that information with respect to either formulating your opinion or supporting your opinion that she perpetuated that abuse in her own?
It supported my opinion in that it is a significant correlation. A history of abuse is often repeated. I think I must say that because a person has a history of abuse or witnessing abuse does not predict that that individual will tolerate or actively perpetrate. However, when the abuse does continue in the next generation, then we do have, it's an explanatory fact, gives you an idea of perhaps the why that the abuse is tolerated. And the entire emotional makeup of the family system is generational. And sans therapy, it often continues from one generation to the next.
Now, it's indicated that you have read the therapy notes of Mrs. Menendez, and in those notes, is it confirmed that, for example, that she married a man just like her father,
Yes,
and that
the emotional setup is replicated.
and does that give you more confidence in your opinion that the acts that were described by various witnesses and the relationship between her husband, and the children, as has been presented in this courtroom, are true? Does it support your opinion that these things happen?
What things?
The her non-interference in her husband's abuse, her perpetuating abuse on the children, her denying them emotional needs, all the things that seem to be replicating her own family life.
Yes, it says nothing about the veracity of the statements of these children, but it supports the idea that the generation is, the abuse is transgenerational.
I don't understand when you say it doesn't support their veracity. If they're describing behaviors similar to the ones that their mother had perpetuated.
It supports it. It supports the veracity. It does not say it's the truth. It's supportive.
And does that support your opinion?
And that supports my opinion. Yes, I said that.
I'll be honest, I don't quite know what she means by it supports the veracity of what they said. It doesn't necessarily mean that what they said is the truth. Like it was, I don't know. I have a feeling that that's probably going to come up on cross-examination of this witness here. It's going to be interesting.
In what way does it support your opinion? Let's assume you did not have any information about the mother's so-called abusive background. What would change, or what would be changed in your opinion about or your opinions that you've expressed here?
That's something that I always look for when I do an assessment of child abuse, actually an assessment of any kind of clinical situation that I'm presented with. I always do as extensive a genogram, a picture of the family as I can, because it does support, for instance, if I'm getting I also get a medical history of families, because if you have a family where depression is a significant, we call it genetic loading for depression, or genetic loading for schizophrenia, or genetic loading for emotional kinds of things. It supports the fact that this happened in this family. It is an important piece, a very important piece.
Are you saying that if you had not had that information provided to you, that you would not have the same opinions that you've expressed here?
No, I'm not saying that. I said this is just more data to support the information that I've been given.
You indicated that in intergenerational situations, that there is some correlation between one generation and the other perpetuating the same situation. Is that correct?
Yes, I am saying that, Judge.
Okay. Is there any statistical breakdown of that in your research?
Well, the literature would support that.
And what percentage-wise, is there any breakdown of that as to 1% of people in that situation?
I can tell you about my
20% or
my own research, which was a 2.5-year study of sexual abusing perpetrators, and compared it, was a cross-matched study, compared it with a non-clinic population of fathers who were matched for age and type of incest perpetration and the socioeconomic status. And that was the most, I did a what we call a statistical manipulation of the data, a multiple discriminant function analysis, threw all my data into the computer and asked that which of the variables, the historical variables, were the most significant in predicting this abuse which had occurred.
Yeah.
And the number one predictor was the history of the perpetrator having been abused or been from an abusive background himself.
All right, and earlier you indicated that such a history does not predict abuse in the next generation.
Well, that's my data. Most research in child abuse is retrospective because you can't set up an abuse situation. It's not ethical. You have to use data that's been given to you. You have to know that something occurred. So you don't use it as a. It would not be fair to predict that one of these children will abuse in the next generation, but there would be a very high possibility that would happen unless there was some significant treatment, significant therapy.
Right, that's what I was asking you. When we say very high possibility, is that broken down in any fashion as far as percentages?
Well, in my particular research, that percentage was 94%.
94% what?
94% of the perpetrators had come from an abusive home.
Okay,
And that's very, very significant statistically.
all right, and
Really quick. Bronwyn W has a question. Is it normal for a judge to be this involved in front of the jury? This seems odd to me. We are not in front of a jury right now. This is outside the presence of the jury and this is why the judge is asking so many questions, is because the whole purpose of her testimony right now is actually as a hearing for him to determine whether or not this testimony is going to eventually come in front of the jury or to the jury. So this is essentially a test run potentially of some testimony, or we're hearing something that the jury will never hear, one way or another. All right.
did either side wish to inquire further?
Yes.
Okay.
Cross-examination.
Ma'am, did you do any kind of generational history on Mr. Menendez, the father?
I did.
So now this is cross-examination.
And did you find that he had been brought up in an abusive home?
Yes,
Okay. Did you find that he had been the victim of sexual abuse?
I did not find that.
Okay. But according to the statistics, if he was in fact a sexual abuser of his children, statistically he would have had to have been sexually
And
abused.
he may have. I don't have that information.
And the reason you don't have it is what?
Is because I didn't get information from his father or his mother or his siblings.
And that would have been helpful, correct?
Any information in this regard is helpful.
Now, the information on Mrs. Menendez was gained from her sisters, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were not able to interview her father because he was deceased.
Right.
You were not able to interview her mother because she was deceased.
That's correct.
And were you aware of the fact that the father, Mrs. Menendez's father, was out of the home on a full-time basis when she was 3 years old?
That's
Can I
correct.
object to that statement? That misstates the facts. In fact, the evidence is that he was frequently in the home.
All right, that's one of the issues, and we can break this down a little bit. That's one of the issues that concerns the court. The court did not have any reservations about the general principle that if there was abuse in one generation, it could very well pass on to another generation. That's pretty much accepted, and no one is disputing that as a general proposition that does happen. The concern the court has is as to the remoteness of this information, that what the defense intends to do and has been proposing to do here, and what counsel referred to inaccurately as what the court well knows about the abuse in some prior generation. The court does not well know that. The court has been provided with some information by counsel of interviews with certain relatives of Mrs. Menendez. And the reason that has been provided to the court is that the counsel want to introduce these witnesses to testify about these matters. And that has been reserved until some later time to determine whether it's relevant, has some probative value. And what concerns the court and why I've sustained objections yesterday on the subject is that this material is very remote. And what we've just witnessed here, a little dispute between counsel about a fact when somebody was living in a house 50 years ago or 40 years ago, in essence, will result in a trial and the consumption of a considerable amount of time about these facts that occurred 30, 40, or 50 years ago in another house, another state, another time, another family, and all for the purpose of what has been put forward here, which at best can be categorized as some support for the testimony of this witness, which is basically supported by, in great extent and almost total extent, on the information that she was provided of what went on and what did not go on in the household of Jose and Mary Louise Menendez and Erik and Lyle Menendez. If she had not had that information, if she only had the fact that there was some abuse in the home of Mary Louise Menendez when she was a child, her testimony would be inadmissible and wouldn't be offered. It wouldn't be here at all. And what concerns this court is that we would get into a trial situation over these remote events that have very little probative value and do tend and would consume a great deal of time. There will be disputes, no doubt. Some relatives will come in and say these events happened 30 or 40 years ago, and other relatives will come in and say they didn't happen. And we'll sit here and try to figure out whether it did or didn't and for what purpose. It doesn't really prove or disprove or change this witness's opinion. Her opinion would be the same regardless of whether she had this information or not. And I assume all the other defense experts would be in the same situation. So what the court's concern is that we would get into an area of a great deal of litigation, generate a lot of heat and very little light, and we would spend a lot of time discussing matters that ultimately don't have very much at all to do with what happened on August the 20th. Well, let's hear Ms. Abramson's first, since this is her witness.
So let me just chime in real quick. I think I do kind of agree with him on this because what he's getting at is okay, there might be some information here that is helpful. However, just how much is it worthwhile going down that rabbit hole, right? Like, in other words, is the juice worth the squeeze? If you're getting a little bit of juice out of it, but you're having to squeeze it a ton, like, we're going to end up down this other side quest that's going to go and have minimal value in comparison to all of the other testimony that she's already providing, that this expert witness is providing already. So this is, this is one of those determinations where the judge has to decide, like, okay, yes, there's information that is maybe helpful, it's relevant, it's, one way or another, but they still have to balance it with just how much, just how much they have to go through in order to get that. How relevant is it? So they because they also can't be wasting court resources, public resources, all this kind of stuff. So that's really the balancing act that he needs with this kind of testimony. I do agree that it is very relevant. But I kind of agree with him at the moment that, it probably is not worth bringing in several more witnesses to talk about it because this is something that happened a long time ago. Obviously Kitty's not around to testify about it. You might have one sibling that says one way, another sibling that says another way. And then you end up maybe confusing the jury as to the issues. So it's just there's this issue of remoteness. Okay, so now let's move forward. Well, I'll play it a little bit longer, but I think we're going to get into argument between the two sides, so we can skip ahead if that's okay.
I think the court keeps disconnecting this evidence from what happened on August 20th in an artificial way. One of the key issues here is Mary Louise Menendez's tolerance of the abusive behavior of her husband as well as her own abusive behavior. Now, she tells her therapist that she married someone like her father. That tells us something about her father right there. But in addition to that, the fact that she was raised in a household with violence is not contested. I mean, even though you have only seen the testimony or the proposed testimony of one sister, there are other witnesses who verified that, but we weren't trying to do a big mini trial of that issue. But the crucial thing here is the credibility of the defendants and the credibility of the defense witnesses, and the likelihood that if she were raised in such an environment, if she admits she's married into such an environment, that corroborates what the defendants are saying, that she tolerated this abuse and participated in it. I don't see how this leads to a huge trial, because we're not going to try to prove all the acts of abuse that occurred to her or occurred in her home, but only the general. We all model on our parents to some extent. And the point here is there were certain messages that came from her household that you can see in her behavior she clearly accepted and patterned her life after. Okay. One of those messages was that abuse is normative because it happened to her. Another message is that divorce is totally destructive of a woman because her mother, and there is no dispute about this, was completely destroyed by the divorce of that family. The other message is that mothers who are completely taken up in their own problems are emotionally unavailable to their children, and that's okay because that's what happened in that family. And the fourth message was what the world thinks of you as the single most important thing in your life, which was her mother's message, her family's message, and her message. And so in that sense, we're trying to show that what has been perceived about her is supported by what she had to model on. And that's what we are all like that. We are all either the direct reflection of our parents or their willful opposites. And so it does tend to reason to support that she is and has these views that we have put into evidence.
May I be heard, please?
I think I'd like Ms. Lansing to be here because she's been working with these witnesses and I think has a clearer factual record.
Well, bear in mind, we don't have her client here, and if this is going to go beyond this witness's testimony, then we should have him here for that purpose.
I think it would, because I think it will come up with, certainly with their experts, as well as with my next expert.
Well, at this point, I want to just complete this witness's testimony and decide whether or not it's relevant to her testimony. So let's hear from the prosecution.
Your Honor, there are certain aspects of this discussion which would be beneficial to the people's case. However, the basis of the opinion of the experts is based upon derivative information. None of the participants, neither Mrs. Menendez, nor her mother, nor her father are alive or were alive to be examined. And because of that, for instance, one of the statements made by Ms. Abramson is that Mary Louise Menendez told her psychologist that she married someone like her father. We don't know what she meant by that. She could have meant he was a strong person and a good provider. We don't know if she meant that in a pejorative sense or in a complimentary sense. And since she's not here to cross-examine, we don't know exactly what she meant by that statement. And so a lot of this information is basically just unreliable. People can extrapolate whatever they want from it, but that's not the kind of evidence that should be presented to a jury, is where everybody can make whatever they want and there's no clear significance to it.
Well, it's also hearsay. If you look at it just from that point, if that's her state of mind, that's what she said she did, then that's hearsay. It's offered for the truth.
Oh,
that's what she did.
Okay, so he's probably not going to admit this in. Let me see here. I think this is where it's going to continue. Yeah, we're continuing arguments. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. Let's get to about here.
Well, it's be 17 minutes. So we'll get the jury a break too, because they've been in the jury room. So we'll resume at 22.
An extensive brief on this issue, which explores not only 1107 of the evidence code, but 1103.
Actually, we're going to go a little bit further ahead when the jury is back and when, sorry, he's going to give like an admonition, generally speaking, about about expert witnesses and how not an admonition, but an explanation that he's at the end, he's going to be giving like, instructions on all kinds of things. And that includes about expert witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. All right, let's continue with this testimony right here.
Proceed.
Remain at council table with the court's permission.
I'm sorry.
I'd like to remain at council table.
Certainly.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, you heard the instruction that the judge just gave to the jury?
I did.
Now, when you are doing an assessment, and particularly when you are doing one for forensic purposes, to come to a court and take the oath and testify, are you interested at all in whether the information you're relying on for your opinion is true?
Yes, of course.
And what do you do in your evaluation to determine the credibility of the information upon which you are relying?
Well, in this case, I attempted to corroborate with third-party reports as many of the statements that Erik Menendez had given me as I possibly could. And I did that by relying upon the witness interviews that had been provided to me.
And with respect to those witness interviews, do you examine them or evaluate them in any way to determine if they are credible?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if a witness, tells you that he saw elephants fly, do you accept that?
If a witness tells me he saw elephants fly, do I accept that? Well,
Yes.
no, I can't accept that.
But my point is, what standards do you use to determine whether the interviews that you read, the third-party corroborating interviews, are themselves accurate?
I have to rely upon the people that did the interviewing, and I have to rely upon the individuals that gave me those interviews to peruse and to draw my conclusions from.
Do you look for consistency and patterns in these interviews that that support their credibility?
I look for internal. I was talking initially about external consistency when I say I have to rely on the sources that gave me the information. But then in terms of the information that's included within those interviews, it's very important to look at the internal consistency of those interviews.
And if you've received interviews from witnesses and then those same witnesses have testified and have been cross-examined and the information they give under oath is consistent with the interview, does that give you any indication of reliability?
Yes, it does.
And if in evaluating witness interviews you have no information from any source that any of the witnesses have any motive to fabricate or to lie or to make things up, does that validate the credibility?
Yes.
Now, does it also matter if the witnesses that you're reading are people who, because of their relationship with the decedents or their relationship with the defendants, would appear to be in a position to have reliable information? Does that weigh in your assessing its credibility?
Indeed, it does.
Now, let's turn to where we were yesterday. I believe we were discussing your evaluation from a psychological maltreatment standpoint of the behaviors of Mrs. Menendez towards her children, and specifically her interactions with Erik Menendez between his ages of 6 to 12 years. I believe yesterday you had indicated those behaviors you were aware of that constituted rejecting and degrading by Mrs. Menendez towards Erik. Do you recall that?
Yes. I don't recall how far we got, however.
Really quick. Let me get some questions here before we get any further down here. Nico Kiski says, question. Last week you said that it's important that this witness appears neutral to the jury. Wouldn't you always want that? Or are there cases when you'd want the expert to appear partial? So what I was probably talking about was not coming across by default before you investigate any of the information, you analyze any of the information, having a particular worldview that is going to automatically result in a particular conclusion. So if I remember correctly, I think I talked about Dr. What's her face from the Depp trial, not Dr. Curry, her counterpart on the other side. She definitely came across that she basically was of the opinion that when you have a male-female relationship, the male can never be abused, which is to a lot of people preposterous. That is going to impact the way that she views any kind of heterosexual relationship where the woman is particularly aggressive. And so that played out in that particular Dr. Dawn Hughes. Thank you, Debbie Faison Cook. I know I always forget her name for some reason. So that, that is oftentimes going to set off some red flags to a jury that is trying to be reasonable. Now, there are definitely, there's always a possibility that you can have jurors who are of that particular worldview that witness is as well. And so they, might eat up what that person has to say. So if you have a sense as the attorney on the case that there might be jurors on there that have that particular worldview, sometimes having that kind of a witness can be, I suppose, beneficial. That said, I still wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it because there are bound to be other jurors on that panel that do not ascribe to that worldview, and it's also a limiting factor in my opinion. So I hope that answers your question. Tish says, what do you mean that they will get instructions in the end? Don't they get instructions from the beginning? Yeah, yes, the judge will give instructions throughout the trial. For example, when every day when they go home, don't look up anything about the case, don't form any final opinions, et cetera, et cetera. Keep an open mind essentially. And don't talk about the case, whatnot, all of that stuff. But there will be very particular jury instructions at the end either before or after closing arguments. I think usually it's going to be before closing arguments. Sometimes different courts will do things a little bit differently. Those jury instructions will be about, going through each element of the charge or of the claim, or if it's a criminal case or a civil case. And then there will also be specific jury instructions about different things as well, including oftentimes expert witnesses. So there will be jury instructions at the very end before they go into deliberation so that they know what to do. They know how to piece together the information that they've collected over this long run of this trial. I hope that that answers your question. All right. Let's continue.
Neither do I. But maybe I have a clue here. I do believe that you discussed yesterday some of the names, some of the negative or pejorative names that she would routinely call him, such as baby and sissy and stupid and dummy and those things. And I believe you discussed her behavior with respect to his schoolwork. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, was there a pattern that you see emerging at this point having to do with Mrs. Menendez blaming Erik for something?
Yes, that pattern was consistent throughout all the developmental periods that I looked at in terms of blaming Erik. Probably everyone has heard these incidents, the blaming for when she'd be blaming Erik for when she would be late. There was a specific incident about Erik not having his tennis rackets
Yes.
for a tournament, and
They've had
that. Okay, those kinds of things.
Was there anything about her blaming Erik and Lyle, for that matter, for her problems or inadequacies or life or that sort of thing?
Well, she often made a statement, or I read it in two different reports, that this is a quote, "I wish you were never born."
And in what context would that be said?
When she would have problems, when she was angry, when she was miserable, when she was sad, she would would blame Erik for her feelings, how she felt about life.
And what message would that convey to a child that because his mother is having problems, his birth somehow is connected to that?
Well, the message that it conveys is that somehow this child is responsible for his mother and what happens in his mother's life, and especially how his mother feels.
And is that a healthy message to be giving to a child 6 to 12 years old?
No, it's a very damaging message. It's a damaging message for any individual to believe that they are somehow responsible for how another person feels.
Is it particularly damaging when the person who's being made to feel responsible is a child?
Oh, yes. Yeah, a child doesn't have any previous experience, only his own, to be able to judge those kinds of statements. And this was a child who, I think I've already talked about his self-esteem, which was very low.
Is this the kind of behavior that can invoke guilt in a child, make them feel guilty for their parents' unhappiness?
Yes.
And did you see in the materials efforts on Erik's part to somehow make up to his mother for his having been born and her troubles that ensued?
Director, calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
Yes. Was there evidence in either the testimony of Erik or the testimony of other witnesses that he was attempting to do things for his mother to please her?
Yes, there was. I think I've talked about some of that.
Right. Turning to the next category, which is terrorizing, or were there behaviors of Mrs. Menendez during this 6 to 12 period that fit the category, come within the category of terrorizing behavior?
Well, I think the aggressiveness, which was corroborated by many of the sources, many of the witness reports that I read, her lack of ability to control her temper, her rages, they were described by several sources as rages where she would yell and scream. And the defendant described that it was not uncommon during one of these rages for her to grab him by the hair and scream at him, pull his hair, and on one occasion or more would kick him. Do you want me to keep going?
Well, let me ask you.
Really quick. Culperistic had a comment about experts being allowed to speculate. To a certain extent, yes. Because remember, a normal lay witness can only testify to what they saw, heard, smelled, etc. It's limited to their 5 senses. An expert is allowed to opine. They're allowed to give their opinion so long as it's within the scope of their expertise. Sometimes that allows a certain amount of speculation. This may have been an objection that was missed because it was, it stretched a little bit too far, or it may have been a point that was allowable under the rules because of the fact that, like I said, the experts are given a little more space to operate in because they have a certain special, unique expertise, which has been properly vetted by the court. So just want to make that point.
Ask you something about this. Why is a parent's anger or rage terrorizing?
Well, because you're a child, and the difference between its size alone between a little boy and a mother, and the little boy even at 18, when I was getting a description of the mother, the boy still perceives the mother as strong and physically muscular and powerful from a physical point of view. So that's the difference in size alone is frightening to a child because the parent has more power. And then, of course, parents have more power because they're a parent and they are the bosses in the household. And this parent made all choices for this child. What he ate, what he wore, what
It-
sports he played.
To focus
Really quick. Also, there was another question from Colperistic. I saved it and then forgot to pull it up and answer it. Would you have considered asking for a bench trial, considering attitudes about male victims of SA and the salacious nature of the crimes, or is the potential sympathy from the abuse cancel that out? It's a really good question, because you have to remember that attitudes towards abuse also can extend to the bench. You know, sure, they can maybe understand more of more technical expert testimony and whatnot, but in cases that don't involve something that's very, very, very technical, generally speaking, I prefer to have a jury trial rather than a bench trial, uh especially if it was this particular judge. I don't know that I would trust a trial where he just decides the case. So I hope that answers your question.
Focus back on the rages, though. Is there something about the fact that they've been characterized as seemingly out of control that made them more frightening than just a parent, getting angry and screaming and telling you to go to your room? And
Well, yes, I think an out of control person is frightening for even adults, because we don't know how to stop that out of control behavior. And if you're a child and your parent is out of control, that would be very frightening, because the child has no ability to get the behavior to stop.
are children only afraid of parents actually hitting them physically when they're angry, or is there something about parental anger that invokes fear even when there's no physical contact?
Objection leading.
Overall. You understand the question?
Yes, I hope I do. Your question is there something besides the actual physical hands-on that would engender terror and in a child?
Well, the question is does anger frighten children even if they're not hit or even if they don't expect to get hit?
Anger is very frightening for children because they can't predict, unless they've had a lot of experience with a parent, what's going to happen next. And if they build on their experiences. We all build on our experiences, but if your experience as a child is when your mother gets angry, she rages and she goes out of control and you don't know what she's going to do, then that is terrorizing.
Is it scary for a child to see a parent out of control, even if the parent doesn't turn that into a physical assault?
Yes, it's very frightening.
Why?
Because the child feels totally unprotected and totally unsafe. And sometimes children have no place to go.
You know the expression when children talk about, gee, I'm afraid to tell this to my dad because he'll get angry. In hypothetically, let's say that this person's not afraid that the father's anger is going to lead to a physical assault, but are children commonly just afraid of angering their
Children
parents?
want to be loved by their caretaker. That's one, going back to that first developmental period, that is the one thing that children have to have, just like food. They have to have that kind of nurturance. And a parent's anger is always threatening to the child and the child's sense of being loved, of being accepted, of being able to trust. And as I reviewed these records, addressing that very issue, I think this boy loved his mother and continued to express love for his mother up until the time that I interviewed him. And
Your Honor, I'd move to strike everything after I think as being speculation on part of the witness.
Objection sustained. The answer is stricken.
Did you form an opinion based on all of the materials that you had read and your assessment of Erik Menendez concerning what his feelings were towards his mother?
Objection, improper opinion.
Sustained.
Did Erik express love for his mother to you during your interviews with him?
yes,
Objection, hearsay.
Overall.
Erik did express love for his mother, and he expressed that he had wanted her love always, and he was continuing to express love the last time I saw him.
And the last time you saw him was when?
Last August. August of 1993.
This August.
This August. 2 months ago.
Now, did you also, I'll strike that. Also under the category of terrorizing, did you classify Mrs. Menendez's threats to turn Erik in effect, to his father?
Yes, I think that was a terrorizing for the child too, and more than that, it was isolating Erik, because a child who is frightened usually has someone that they can talk to about being frightened, and Erik could not turn to his father when his mother would rage or scare him, because or when his mother was late or forgot the tennis rackets or any of those other things, because he knew that his father then would punish him. I think Erik perceived his father, as I said yesterday, as another arm of his mother in terms of her ability to discipline him.
And did he perceive his mother as another arm of his father as well?
Did he perceive his mother as an arm of his father?
Yeah.
I think definitely in the later years he did, when the father was around more, and following the report of the affair, of his father's 8-year affair.
Now, it's your understanding, is it not, from the materials and from Erik's testimony, that the father in the early years' mode of punishment was beating with a belt?
Yes.
And so how do you put in context then a mother who would blame a child for her failings, report him to the father, knowing he's going to be beaten with a belt for something he didn't do?
Well, that put Erik in an uncompromising position. It locked him in. He couldn't turn anywhere. The mother kept or I don't know who had the belt on the coffee table, but the belt belonged to the father, and the belt was kept on the coffee table. And then there was a belt that was kept in Erik's closet, which was used for punishment. And in one of the interviews I read, I know that Erik had moved the belt. Somebody had moved the belt, and Erik got into a lot of trouble for having done that.
I believe it was Erik moved the belt and was punished by his father for moving it. You recall that?
Yes.
Objection, assumes facts not known.
Sustained for the answer, sir.
This is a report that you relied on in forming your opinion?
Yes.
Now, my question, though, was, what does it say about a mother who would set a child up blameless, make him take the blame, knowing that he's going to be beaten with a belt for something he didn't do? What does that tell us about the mother?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Well, Your Honor, I'd like to be heard on that.
Well, let's go on to something else.
Is that terrorizing behavior by the mother? In other words, if she has this knowledge, then is her doing that terrorizing behavior?
Objection, irrelevant.
You're asking about the impact it could have on the child?
Yes. That's behavior to terrorize a child.
The psychological impact would be terrorization
Now, in the
and isolation.
in the same developmental period, did you make an assessment of the behavior by the mother that constituted denying emotional needs of Erik?
Yes, throughout all the developmental periods.
And what were the specifics, though, during this developmental period that constituted a denying emotional needs?
Well, I think one of the most significant ones, and perhaps this has already been talked about, was Erik was taught how to get rid of tears, because crying was not an acceptable behavior in the family, not tolerated by either of the parents. And his method, and I think it was during this period that he began to call himself Hurt Man. There would be tears, and his mother taught him to put water in his eyes and then expose his eyes to the air, and that would get rid of the tears. When I asked him if that worked, he said yes, in fact, that had been helpful to him.
To get rid of the tears?
To get rid of the tears.
Was there any indication that along with teaching him how to hide the tears, she gave him any comfort for whatever it was that was causing him to cry?
No, she was unable to comfort him.
Well, what do you mean by unable? Did she try and fail?
She didn't try. At least I couldn't find any place in any of the interviews where there was any attempt to comfort the child.
Then why do you say unable rather than unwilling or uninterested?
Objection argumentative.
Why do you use the word unable? Do you mean emotionally unable?
Emotionally unable. Emotionally, the term we use is unavailable for some reason.
Okay, and that reason could be either based on her character or willful, could it not?
Objection calls for speculation.
Well, when you use the term unavailable, are you making a determination as to whether she is helplessly unavailable, or anybody is against their own desires unavailable, or willfully unavailable?
Yes,
Could it be either?
it can be that and other reasons.
Well, what other reasons?
Objection irrelevant.
Did you ever see any indication that Mrs. Menendez made herself available for comfort to Erik?
May I ask you a question about,
No.
or have you clarified the?
If you don't understand the question, I'll ask it again. You've talked already that you saw no evidence of her ever being comforting or supporting in any of the information. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you see any evidence that she ever tried to be?
I recall one time that Erik was promised, and this is a report, self-report by Erik, that his mother, if he won some sort of a tennis tournament or tennis game, that she would bake him a pumpkin pie. And that was very significant to him because his memory was that was really the only time he felt that Mom was going to reward something that he had done. And that appeared to be not comforting when he was hurt, but more rewarding for performance.
Okay. Now, was there anything about Mrs. Menendez's dealing with his nightmare fears or his nightmares that fell into the category of denying emotional needs?
Not only denying of emotional needs, but terrorization, because the way the nightmares were handled when Erik was a child is he would be put into a cold tub of water to wake him up.
Yes.
From the nightmare. And that's the way he was comforted, which
Is that
I do
comforting?
not find comforting. I find that not only unresponsive, but actively terrorizing.
And you're familiar with the anecdote that Erik related in his testimony about his mother and father colluding to terrify him with a mask in a closet when he was already fearful.
Yes, I remember that.
So would that constitute active terrorizing?
That would constitute active terrorizing.
Now,
I remember that, I believe, in a later period.
I believe it was the Pennington house, so it would be this period.
Okay, Counselor.
Yeah.
There's a question.
All right. Concerning Erik's learning disabilities, was there evidence of those during the years that he was 6 to 12?
Yes, there was.
And was there any evidence that during those years, 6 to 12, there was any effort to address those disabilities in the home?
No, there was no evidence.
Now, you've already testified to some of the things that were done during this period that constituted isolation. And I think one of the things you testified to was this being placed in the closet periodically to do homework.
Yes,
Were there any other behaviors? And by the way, the incidents that you're familiar with, okay, are those, do you believe that based on your understanding of how patterns of abuse tend to be repeated, are these the total extent of all things that ever happened to Erik, or is this just a sampling?
Objection to the form of the question, Your Honor. As repeated.
Is this or these things, what does you refer to?
To the specific incidents that have been reported through witnesses and through Erik's report to you.
Again, it's
A little broad.
Based on
Nice
your work with
gossip.
children, Dr. Tyler, clinically speaking, do children remember every single thing that ever happened to them?
No, none of us do.
And based on your assessment of psychological maltreatment, is that based on looking for patterns that repeat themselves over and over again?
Yes, I believe I've talked about the importance of patterns, particularly when it comes to maltreatment of children. Patterns over a period of time, patterns over generation. And you look for those to see if there's specific things that happen, almost with predictability after you, we're all entitled to one mistake, but a pattern is something that's very significant, particularly in this area.
And in your studies of psychological maltreating parents, do they tend to repeat those behaviors? If you find a discernible pattern, does that tend to define repetitive behavior on their part?
That is one thing that we know, and the literature would support that.
You're asking if they've done it once. The child, they would do it more than once?
Yes, that's all I'm asking. Is this the way they tend to behave? When you find a pattern, does this tell you that this is how this parent tends to behave on these issues towards this child?
That is correct. A parent who has established a pattern without outside intervention, some sort of social service agency coming in or some sort of therapeutic intervention, would tend to continue with that kind of parenting behavior.
Okay, my question is this. You've heard about many, many incidents that occurred between Mrs. Menendez and Erik that
Yes, I
you
have.
have assessed as constituting patterns of psychological
That
maltreatment.
is correct.
Do you have any reason to believe that that with respect to all other times in his life, she behaved differently than what is reflected in the patterns established by these incidents?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overall.
I have no reason to believe that her treatment of Erik changed.
What I'm asking is, do you think you have heard about everything that she would have done?
I'm sure I have not heard about everything because I think it would be impossible to have every incident of this boy's life on paper, or for him to have memory, particularly now that I know what the memory deficit was that this child was dealing with the new material I received yesterday. I would not have expected Erik to remember everything.
The material that you received yesterday was from what source, Dr. Tyler?
That material came from the Lewis School in Pennsylvania
New Jersey, I believe.
or New Jersey, and
Okay, and do you recall from that material at what age Erik was involved with the Lewis School?
I believe he was taken there at age 15 and a half.
And do you recall how long it was that he was attending the Lewis School?
I think it was a short period of time to have several weeks to have remedial tutoring for mathematics. He was taken to see if the school, which specializes in working with learning disabilities in children and attention deficit disorders, he was taken there by his mother to see if they could tutor him to bring his math performance up.
Now, let me ask you something. From the materials that you saw, did the Lewis School routinely administer a wide variety of tests?
Yes, they did. I looked at the list of tests that he should have received, and then in fact, the testing that was done.
And was he fully tested?
No, he was not. I understand that permission was denied.
By whom?
Your Honor, move to strike, I understand, and everything after that is being hearsay.
Sustain. Answer stricken.
Well, does the fact that you received, did this information that you received from the Lewis School contribute to your opinion that Erik's learning disabilities were not dealt with appropriately by the parents and constituted psychological maltreatment under the category of denying emotional needs?
Objection, compound, calls for improper opinion.
Sustain.
Did you rely upon this information from the Lewis School in formulating your opinions?
I did.
And did it inform your opinion concerning the denial of emotional needs by depriving Erik of the remedial work he needed for his learning disabilities?
It did.
And is it your understanding, based on those materials, that the parents would not allow him to be fully tested?
That is
Your Honor,
correct.
move to strike is hearsay.
Objection sustained. The answer stricken.
Well, I'd like to approach on this, Your Honor.
Yes.
In reviewing the records from the Lewis School, Dr. Tyler, did that make you aware of specific learning disabilities that Erik was experiencing at 15 and a half?
Yes, it did.
And would you just briefly just list what the names of those disabilities were as reflected in their test records?
Objection, Your Honor.
I don't know if I have the report with me, but I think I can remember sufficiently. If you have the report, I'd like to see it.
I will. Why don't you try to remember, and then if you miss anything,
Well,
I'll
I
show you
think one of the
report.
things that was the most striking is well, first of all, I was struck with the fact that there wasn't any extensive psychological testing given there was one projective test given, and having looked at that one projective test, I was concerned that further tests had not been allowed. But from the tests that were given, it appeared as if Erik had some very significant difficulties in dysgraphia, which is a problem with writing. He had some reading problems.
A problem with the physical act of
with
writing?
the physical act of writing. He had a problem with memory. And it was seen throughout short-term, long-term memory problems.
Was there something, is that what's referred to as dysnomia?
Dysnomia.
And
Memory, problems with memory for names of things.
Names,
Get mixed up.
places, dates, titles.
Places, dates, titles.
And what about dyslexia? Was there a finding of that?
Yes.
And was there a finding of attention deficit disorder with hyperactivity?
Well, that finding was suspected. It needed to be corroborated by reports from teachers and reports from parents. And none of that cooperation, as far as I could tell, was allowed by the Menendez family.
Interesting. We've talked about ADHD a little bit, and the possibility that he may have had ADHD. Very, very interesting what she just said about that.
Oh. I'd like to try to move through some of this other material concerning the actual psychological maltreatment that Erik experienced at the hands of both of his parents. So what I'd like to do is the things that you've talked about as beginning in the 6 to 12 period concerning Mrs. Menendez's way of expressing rejection and degradation and her method of terrorizing and the manners in which she denied emotional needs. Did all of those continue through the next period?
Yes, they did.
Now,
In one form or another.
Now, in the next period, which is adolescence 13 to 18, was there, however, a set of behaviors on Mrs. Menendez's part that were particularly significant in Erik's perception of himself and perception of the family?
Yes, which category?
Well, we're talking mainly with respect to Mrs. Menendez's mental condition, leaving her to write a suicide letter.
This was a period of time
Now,
when-
what period are you talking about?
The 13 to 18, if you move to that period,
Okay, let me ask you some
12 to
questions.
18.
Concerning, are you aware of the fact that she left a suicide letter and that she left it on purpose for Erik to find?
I am aware of that.
Objection, calls for speculation as to leaving it on purpose for her son to find.
Well, are you aware of
Sustain the answer.
a statement that she made to Dr. Summerfield that she left it on purpose for Erik to find?
Move to strike as hearsay.
Your Honor, I think that comes in as state of, thank you.
Yes, on reviewing that therapy information that was disclosed
By her to Dr. Summerfield.
by Mrs. Menendez to Dr. Summerfield, that she left this letter threatening suicide on purpose for Erik to find.
And did she also reveal that she knew full well that Erik found it?
Yes, she did.
And did she also reveal that Lyle responded to it and contacted her and to try to support her?
Your Honor, objection, hearsay.
Overall.
Yes, the information that I read was that Erik had become very frightened and had called his brother. Erik was alone. He was in a new house, a new school, and pretty much alone in the house with his mom and feeling, I think, extremely responsible. And he was very fearful. And of course, as any child would be. And I saw this as a very vicious act on the part of a mother.
Why
to-
why would you characterize it as vicious? Why is it vicious if she's feeling badly that she leaves a suicide letter around for her 16-year-old son to find?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustain.
Well, what category did you put this act of hers in?
I categorize this as terrorizing.
And why is it terrorizing for her to leave this suicide letter for her child to find?
Well, this was a child who, as we've known throughout his history of his relationship with his mother, had felt very responsible for how his mother felt. Her anger, her rages, she made him responsible for her own tardiness, her own forgetfulness. And he loved his mother. And to pick up a letter like this and be all alone would be terrorizing. I think terrorizing for any child. And it's viewed clinically as a real act of hostility
Towards the child?
towards the child.
Is this the kind of thing that would frighten a child?
Yes, I said it would not only frighten, I think in this case it was terrorizing.
And my question, though, had been, did you also verify from Dr. Summerfield's notes that Lyle responded
Yes.
in a supportive way to try to help her?
Objection, calls for double hearsay.
Sustain to the form of the question.
Did you recall from Dr. Summerfield's notes that Mrs. Menendez told Dr. Summerfield that the chain of events was she left the letter, Erik found it, Erik contacted Lyle, Lyle called her?
Yes. And Mrs. Menendez then blamed Erik for her troubles,
Blamed Erik?
and Lyle. Lyle offered to come home. Lyle offered in a letter to or in this conversation to his mother, and this was reported to Summerfield, that Lyle offered to make things better and have Erik and his mother live with him, and he was going to try to fix it. And Mrs. Menendez was very angry about that. And although she reported to her therapist that she was touched by Lyle's concern, she did not want any part of that.
Now, is this, you had talked early on about one component of psychological maltreatment being when a parent uses a child to meet their own needs.
That's correct.
correct?
I did talk about that. That
And-
is one of the things that we look at in terms of the total picture of psychological maltreatment is when a parent uses a child as an extension of themselves to get their needs met. A parent who's unable to allow the child to have their own life.
And is there information in Dr. Summerfield's notes and his opinions that Mrs. Menendez's attitude towards her children was only seen from the perspective of how they could meet her needs rather than how she could meet theirs?
Objection, hearsay.
Objection sustained. It is hearsay. You'll have to frame it in some other way as to whether or not this witness relied upon such information for such purpose. But again, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that the witness relates this information doesn't establish that the information that is related, that these events actually happened. It's just information that she is using to form certain opinions. She assumes that these things happen and therefore uses it as a basis for certain opinions that she expresses.
Okay. In assessing Mrs. Menendez's maltreating behavior of denying emotional needs, did you rely, at least in part, on the information from Dr. Summerfield?
I did.
And how did that information inform your opinion concerning denying needs or how needs were dealt with in this family system?
The information that I used was Dr. Summerfield's description of what Mrs. Menendez had reported to him and what his diagnosis of her was.
And how did that relate to, if you could just tell us the bottom line, which is about...
Dr. Summerfield talked about something called narcissism, which is a psychological term, psychiatric term.
Your Honor, I'd move to strike this testimony as being hearsay.
It's not being
As
offered.
to Dr. Summerfield's analysis.
Well, let's objection sustained as to that portion of the answer. And you may re-ask questions a different way.
The issue is, what is the information contained from Dr. Summerfield's materials that you are relying on that tells you about Mrs. Menendez's meeting or not meeting the emotional needs of her child?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Sustained. If counsel want to approach, we can discuss the issue.
Yes.
All right.
Dr. Tyler, all that would come down to this. Did you find support?
Without giving us the underlying information, did you find support in Dr. Summerfield's materials for your opinion of Mrs. Menendez as a person who denied the emotional needs of her kids and used them to fulfill her own needs?
I found strong support of that.
Was there any significance in your assessment of Mrs. Menendez and her psychological maltreatment of Erik in these years to the fact that she bought a rifle and made a statement that someone's going to be killed?
Yes, I did
And-
take note of that.
What was the significance of that particular episode?
I think the significance of that episode is, again, a form of terrorization of a child and also a form of isolation. It enhances, in a child's mind, enhances the power that the mother has. She now has a firearm.
And is there any indication that Erik would believe that she was not capable of using it?
I have no indication of that in the material that I have reviewed.
Is there any indication in the material that Erik would believe that she is capable of using it?
Objection
Yes,
calls for speculation.
Sustained. The answer is stricken.
You reviewed Eric's testimony where he believed that she would use it. Did you not?
I did.
Is there anything about her behavior up until that point that was inconsistent with that belief?
There was not.
Now, I want to turn to Mr. Menendez, if we can. And with respect to Mr. Menendez, could you characterize briefly the basic psychological maltreatment patterns that you saw with respect to him over the course of Eric's life?
Over the course of Eric's life, with respect to Mr. Menendez,
If you could just give us a general picture.
okay. Well, the rejection and degrading definitely was part of that picture because Eric's perception of his relationship with his dad and also other family members and coach's perception of Eric's relationship with his dad was that he was not important to his father. Certainly not important in the way that his older brother was. He wasn't as good a tennis player. He wasn't. He didn't think he was as smart. And he didn't give Eric the one-on-one attention that he gave the older son. In addition, when Eric was given a tennis coach, it was always the coach that wasn't as good as the coach that coached his other brother. So the messages throughout Eric's growing up were that dad was rejecting of him.
Let me ask you
Dad
something.
called him names.
What was the most distinctive component, though, of the way that Jose Menendez ran his family? What was the thing he relied upon to do that?
He relied upon his position of power. He was Eric told me that he and his brother viewed his father as all-knowing, knew everything. He was very smart. He was very powerful in the business world. He was ruthless. He cut through everything to achieve the end.
What role, if any, did fear play in the way Mr. Menendez ran the family?
Eric was very fearful of his father.
Well, did Mr. Menendez use fear? Was it deliberate?
Yes, he used fear.
Was terrorizing the chief component of his maltreatment?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
What significance did terrorizing have as an aspect of Mr. Menendez's maltreatment of the children?
It had a very significant effect on both children. Certainly Eric, the terrorization over the years of the alleged sexual maltreatment.
Did you find terrorizing only in conjunction with the sexual maltreatment, or were there other examples of Mr. Menendez terrorizing his son?
Well, there were all kinds of examples. Probably a lot of these incidents have been recounted.
Are you familiar with the testimony of other witnesses who indicated that they found Mr. Menendez intimidating and frightening?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any reason to believe that he acted less intimidating or less frightening with his children?
I have no reason to believe that.
And with respect to the perspective of a child, with the person who adults find intimidating and terrorizing, what is the likely impact of that individual on a child?
Objection calls for speculation.
Rephrase the question.
So with respect to Mr. Menendez in particular, you made an assessment of his impact on Eric with respect to fear-inducing behaviors.
Is that a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And what was the impact on Eric of his father's intimidation, his strength, and his fear-inducing behaviors?
The impact upon Erik was that he thought his father could hurt him, and that his father told him very definitely that what he did to him was not ever to be revealed to anybody, because if he did, he would be killed.
And what does that produce in a child when you're warned to keep a secret and there's a threat of death if you don't? Does that itself fit into another category of psychological maltreatment besides just terrorizing?
Besides terrorization and besides exploiting and besides denying emotional needs, it very definitely isolates the child because the child has no place to go.
Would a child risk telling this secret when a parent like Mr. Menendez has threatened death upon revelation?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, in your study of children, you've studied children who were sexually molested as well.
Yes, I have.
And you studied children who were in abusive families where parents threaten harm to the children if they do certain things or if they reveal the secrets.
Yes,
Did those children tend to tell?
Those children do not tend to tell. It is very rare for a child to tell until they feel like they've got some safety of some sort.
And is that why
Sometimes children don't tell until they're 40, 50 years old? And often after the perpetrator is deceased. Only then do children tell, very often. Because of that terror, that threat.
Can children be controlled with fear and threats?
Absolutely.
Now, was isolating a key component of the psychological maltreatment practiced by Mr. Menendez?
Yes, I think isolating within the family for this boy, he was threatened not to tell anybody within the family. He certainly couldn't tell outside of the family. He was told that his mother was his father's friend, and so he knew that he couldn't go to her. He had been treated in such a way by his mother that this child could not have felt that mother could intervene. When he would go into the room with his father and the door would be locked, and then come out of the room and go to the bathroom and vomit, there was no intervention. And if you don't have intervention when that happens, how can you have intervention for anything else? The type of maltreatment of this isolation from folks outside the family, even though Erik played tennis, he had coaches, he went to an expensive school, he had a lot of material advantages. That didn't make the difference. He was still very, very isolated. The coaches changed over a period of time so that he never really had an opportunity to develop an intimate, trusting relationship with the coach. And the coaches had been intimidated by the father anyway.
And with respect to the teachers, did you see a similar pattern that although he had contact with a lot of teachers, the teachers were intimidated by these parents?
Yes, I read in report on report of the teachers that this man was intimidating.
Did you ever see any evidence that any of the teachers tried to intervene, even those who seemed to realize there was something wrong with the family?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Would Erik have, based on the material you've seen, would Erik have ever experienced a teacher intervening on his behalf? Is there any evidence that that ever happened?
I read one report given by a teacher where the teacher had tried to suggest to Mr. Menendez something about Erik's absences from school because of his tennis, I believe it was. But she was making a suggestion that was in Erik's best interests, and she was rebuffed, and she then withdrew and stated that there wasn't anything that she could do.
My question is, though, did you see any evidence whatsoever that anyone actually did intervene to Erik's knowledge? Any teacher?
No, I didn't see that.
Did you
I
see?
saw attempts, but it was never carried through.
Did you ever see any indication that any teacher ever even went to Erik and said, "Kid, I know you're in a bad situation. I feel sorry for you," or "I empathize"? Anything like that, even?
No.
Now, is that kind of an outreach by an adult? Can that help? Is that an intervention that could help a kid in an abusive family? If a teacher or coach says, "Boy, you know, those people are miserable. I side with you." I mean, even that, can that help?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Can that ameliorate some of the damage of psychological maltreatment if it occurs?
Well,
Objection.
Sustained.
Well, do you see
If there
any?
was any indication of that, did you see it? Did you see any such efforts made by anybody? You've answered that no, is that right?
yes, that's correct.
Are those considered ameliorating events?
Those are considered ameliorating events.
And did you see any evidence of ameliorating events such as intervention by other adults in this family?
I did not. I saw attempts, but no intervention.
Now, is there another kind of ameliorating event? For example, what role, if any, did the athletics play in Erik's adjustment or in his development? I mean, apart from the pressure from the parents, is there any positive side to the athletics?
Yes, I think the athletics were probably very definitely a way that this boy could achieve some success in his life and some release of tension, some physical exercise.
And are those things helpful in for abused children to be able to cope with the abuse that's going on if there is some ameliorating event like athletics or a release of tension?
Very definitely.
Now, returning, well, it is noon, Your Honor.
All right, we'll recess until 1:30, ladies and gentlemen. Don't discuss the matter. As I was saying,
Recess.
we're all here and ready to resume. You may continue your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Tyler, I just want to focus you on Jose Menendez and his interaction with his sons during the period when Erik is 16 to 18. Was there some additional thing, if you will, that Jose Menendez was doing in order to impress his sons with his power, to keep them fearful and to keep them isolated during those later years?
Objection vague, the term sons and the age defined.
All right, if you could be more specific.
I'm focusing on when Erik was 16 to 18, okay? Was there a behavior of Jose Menendez's that would constitute additional isolating behavior, additional terrorizing behavior, a way to instill additional fear in Erik's mind?
We've talked about the isolation at length, how Jose would isolate Erik from within the family and from outside of the family. But when you say impressing Erik with his personal power and his terrorization, I think between 16 and 18, I would use the term overwhelm Erik with his sense of personal power. He told Erik stories about his ability to have people killed. He talked about connections with the mafia, talked about people in business, how he handled them, how he took care of them in terms of having them do things his way, and how he could have them dismissed. I think it was more than an impression. I think it was almost an overwhelming.
And would that fit patterns that you're familiar with in abusive families where the assertion of power and the instilling of fear by the tyrannical parent, if you will, increases as the kids get older?
It has to increase in order to keep the kid, using your terminology, in place, still under their dominance, still under their control, still
So-
under their ability to terrorize them.
So that is a pattern that you've seen in studying abusive families.
It is a pattern. And as I said earlier, that sometimes goes up until an individual is 30, 40. I've had women talk to me for the first time about their abuse at age 50.
Are you familiar with families in which abused children remain in the family home well into their own adulthood, 30s or 40s, who are still being abused by parents?
Yes. That's not an uncommon phenomena for the abuse to continue. And it will continue until something breaks the pattern, until something happens.
Now, you were not called to testify in this case. You were not the expert who was called to testify about an assessment of the sexual molestation in this case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
However, you did mention it earlier in your testimony. You have experience, do you not, in evaluating children to determine if their allegations of sexual abuse are in fact true?
Yes, I have.
And when you were doing your evaluation in this case, had any determination been made yet at that point as to who was going to testify to what aspects?
No, there had not been.
So did you do a complete evaluation of Erik Menendez as a victim of sexual molestation at the hands of his father?
Yes, I did.
And did you come to an opinion as to whether or not he was in fact molested by his father?
Yes, I did.
And what is your opinion?
My opinion,
Objection, irrelevant.
Yeah.
Foundation.
Sustained.
I don't understand the foundation objection, Your Honor.
Okay, we can have you approach and we can
Thank
discuss it.
Okay, Your Honor, I will withdraw that last line of question, and I have no further questions at this time.
Examination.
Cross-examination. Here we go.
Ma'am, I believe you indicated that this case came to you through a referral through a consortium of which you are a member. Is that correct?
that's correct.
Do you know who referred the case to the consortium?
I'm assuming that the defense attorneys made that referral. I believe it was at a professional meeting in San Diego.
Now, the diagram, the chart which is on the board, which is exhibit, I think it's 295, which is entitled psychological maltreatment. Where do these categories, these 6 categories that you've been discussing in your testimony, come from?
Those 6 categories come from a consensus of the professionals, and it comes from the literature in terms of what is an operational definition of psychological maltreatment.
Okay, so it's your testimony then that these 6 categories are recognized in the literature dealing with psychological maltreatment
Yes, they are.
as well-defined subcategories. Is
That's
that
correct.
correct? Right. And I believe that you've indicated that that it's maltreatment, correct, and not abuse. I mean, why is it you use the term maltreatment and not abuse?
It's a different name for abuse.
Now, any of those items, the 6 items which are listed there on that exhibit, are any of them the activities that the parents engage in to terrorize or isolate their children? Are any of those things reportable to the authorities for criminal prosecution?
Any of those things that a parent does to the child, are they reportable?
Yes.
Yes, indeed they are.
And is that in California?
That's, I would assume that every state in the union has, I wouldn't assume, I know that every state has a child abuse reporting law and that it is against the law to hurt a child. I looked at the California, for instance, the categories there, and sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, those are all definable categories as
All right, so when you pointed out the fact that the Menendez family did not fully explore Erik Menendez's dysgraphia and didn't get him all the help they should have gotten him, that's something that's reportable to the authorities for prosecution?
well, if that's just a piece of the information that was not given. This was part of the pattern. And yes, as a matter of fact, under Public Law 94-142, if a parent does not follow through on educational recommendations, there are problems. A parent can be charged with neglect, educational neglect.
Is that in Utah?
That's national.
Well, you mean that's a federal statute? Is that what you're talking about?
Each state has their own abuse or their own laws regarding this. But yes, the 94-142 is federal.
Okay. And then if you talked about exploiting a child and wanting a child to fulfill the parent's fantasies or fulfill the parent's needs. So wanting your child to go to an Ivy League school, is that something that's reportable?
I think.
Well, is it or isn't it?
We're taking this out of context. I'm not talking about a child wanting their kid to go to an Ivy League school as being exploitive and having that be reportable as far as child abuse. I'm talking about that being part of a pattern of having the child fulfill a parent's needs. That was just a piece of the data that was given to me.
Now, you talked about taking things out of context, correct? Just use that term, right?
Yes.
Okay. The information that you got in order to prepare your evaluation was information you got from the defendants, correct?
Yes, it was.
The defense attorneys.
That's correct.
Okay. I believe you indicated that you read a lot of testimony in this case.
I did.
Did you read the people's testimony, the people's case in chief?
I read every bit of the testimony that has been sent to me and what you've put on here. Yes.
All right. Do you know if you received the testimony of the officers who came to the crime scene?
Yes.
Did you receive the testimony of the coroner?
Yes.
Okay. And did you receive the testimony of Erik Menendez in its entirety, including his cross-examination?
I did.
And you believed everything that Erik Menendez said in his examination?
Objection, Your Honor, improper question.
Rephrase the question.
Did you believe to be true the facts as stated by Erik Menendez in his direct examination about the circumstances surrounding the killings of his parents?
I'm going to object to that line of question, Your Honor, since it's beyond the scope of this witness's testimony.
She based her opinion on it.
And I object to arguing.
Rephrase the question, then
Okay.
proceed with that.
Yeah, because what she's really trying to get at is, do you like? She's trying to ask her if she believes whether or not they should be guilty or not. That's definitely outside the scope of her expertise. She's not a legal expert. She's not really any of these things. She's not supposed to be supplanting the jury. And the reason why Pam wants this is probably because she would have some sort of a smaller informed opinion. She wouldn't be able to opine that far to say whether or not she believed, that the brothers actually were in fear of their lives, et cetera, et cetera. So it's definitely going too far outside the scope of her expertise and getting into like her setting foot in the jury box, essentially, in order for her to answer that.
Ma'am, you based your opinion about whether or not Erik Menendez had been psychologically maltreated upon things that he told you in part. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And his ability to tell the truth was important in your evaluation as to whether or not these things actually occurred, correct?
That was a piece of it. But his ability to tell the truth about what happened to him as a child, his psychological maltreatment.
Yes.
Well, I had most of that corroborated by other interviews, by other people, by extended family, by teachers, by coaches.
Okay, like the locking in the closet incidents, you had that corroborated?
No, that was Erik's testimony to me, that he had been locked into the closet.
And you found that to be very, very significant.
Well, I believed it as part of his testimony that he had been psychologically maltreated. His perception was that he was locked in the closet. And as a matter of fact, I'm sorry, I do have corroboration of that specific statement. I think we have to be careful we don't take this piece by piece because we look at the pattern. But yes, I do have corroboration for that particular one because there was a letter, and I have seen the letter written by Mary Louise Menendez to her son Lyle regarding her brother, her son Erik, doing his homework in the closet. And then she made another comment about something about the little devil, and I had inquired what that little devil meant. And in fact, Erik told me that he didn't think that she meant he was the little devil. She was referring to the ferret that was also in the closet. So I do have, I've tried very hard to corroborate.
And one of the
So what Pam is trying to do here is to make her look like some kooky doctor who just comes in and is sort of trying to make her look like a provider of junk science analysis, right? To say that she's just coming in and just believing the brothers for their word and that's it. And that's what everything is based on, right? So if you don't believe the brothers on their own, then therefore you shouldn't believe anything that she says, or you shouldn't take into consideration anything that she says, any of her opinions here, because they're all based on the brothers being true. But so far the witness has been doing a pretty good job of saying, actually, so far everything that we've talked about, or all of these points that you've brought up, including him being locked away in the closet, has all been corroborated. I'm trying to be very careful to make sure that I am making conclusions based off of information that can be corroborated. So she's making all of these points, and if the jury is paying attention, then this is all very important points. It's almost like giving a guide map for the jury to be making their conclusions. Obviously, whether or not the jury is listening is another matter. We don't know. We have no idea one way or another. But I find this to be pretty engaging and pretty interesting so far. And I'm someone who doesn't always have a very strong focus for long durations of time. So I think so far she's handling this cross-examination pretty well, despite what the prosecution is trying to do. But let's see how this continues.
one of the things that you did is you reviewed his testimony in court, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you reviewed not only his direct, but his cross-examination.
I did.
Okay. And after that, did you have any questions in your own mind as to whether or not he had told you the truth about everything when you talked to him?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the form of the question.
They didn't cross-examine about.
Counsel, again, let's not argue the matter. We object to the form of the question
Yes.
and legal objection.
I think it's calling for conclusion speculation by the witness.
Rephrase the question in regards to the witness's state of mind and how she approached to task.
Is it important that the information that you base your opinion on be correct?
Yes, it is.
Is
As
it-
correct as possible.
Is it important that the conclusions you reach be based on facts?
Yes, but again, let's not just narrow it down. Let's talk about the totality of the picture. I'm assuming that all the facts that I've been given, the data that I've been given from Erik, from Lyle, from the witnesses and all the things that I've read, I'm assuming that there's going to be error in that. There's going to be some distortion of memory. There may be some lying, but I look at the general picture. That's
Now, are you aware of the fact that after the crime, that Erik Menendez lied about his participation in it?
yes, I am.
And you're aware of the fact that he lied to almost everybody who would sit still and listen, correct?
Object to the form of the question, Your Honor, since that's not in evidence and is argument.
Rephrase the question.
You're aware of the fact that Erik Menendez engaged in a pattern of lying to the authorities and to his family.
Object to the form of the question, Your Honor, since that's not in evidence.
Objection
By
overruled.
his family.
Objection overruled.
After the crime was committed. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes, I'm aware that Erik did not confess to the fact that he had been involved in this.
Well, not only did he not confess, but he diverted attention away from himself. It wasn't a failure to talk. It was the fact that he actually told people that other people had done it, correct?
Yes,
I'm going to object to the form of the question, since that's not in evidence and argument.
It is argumentative. Rephrase the question.
Be aware of the fact that at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, after he killed his parents, he was interviewed by a detective from the Beverly Hills Police Department.
Yes, I'm aware of
And
that.
he was asked questions about his parents' killings and his whereabouts that night.
That's correct.
And you're aware that he lied to the authorities.
Yes, I'm aware of that. The
Did you-
fact that he lied about not having been involved in the killing of his parents doesn't mean that his whole life has been a lie and all the abuse is a lie. I think that that's stretching it. But
But
I
is it-
think to take the fact that he lied about the crime to that he's lied about everything in his life is not fair.
Did you read his testimony where he said that the reason he went to San Diego to purchase shotguns was because he couldn't buy handguns at the Big Five sporting goods store in Santa Monica?
I read that.
Okay. Did you read the cross-examination wherein he was asked, isn't it true that that store has not sold handguns since
Your Honor, I'm
1986?
going to object to this as beyond the scope. In these particular aspects, it's beyond the scope of her testimony.
Did you read that portion of the cross-examination?
I did read that portion. That had nothing to do with what I was asked to do, which was evaluate if this child had suffered from abuse or not, and what the pattern of abuse in fact was.
But if the information that he told you was untrue, then how does that affect your opinion?
It doesn't affect my opinion.
So if information and facts you received from Erik Menendez were false, that doesn't change your opinion?
Erik had no reason to lie to me about his abuse. His coaches had no reason to lie. The teachers had no reason to lie. His family members had no reason to lie. So I depended upon that to form the basis of my opinion.
You're saying that Erik Menendez had no reason to tell you false stories of abuse. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that he had no reason to tell me false stories of abuse.
Are you familiar with this book I'm holding
I'm
up?
very familiar with that. That's our diagnostic statistical manual.
Okay.
DSM-3R revised.
Are you familiar with the concept of malingering?
Yes, I am.
Your Honor, I'm going to, so you are familiar with this particular portion of the DSM-3?
Yes, I'm familiar with malingering.
May I proceed? The essential feature of malingering is intentional production of false or grossly exaggerated physical or psychological symptoms motivated by external incentives, such as avoiding military conscription or duty, avoiding work, obtaining financial compensation, evading criminal prosecution, obtaining drugs, or securing better living conditions. Under some circumstances, malingering may represent adaptive behavior. For example, feigning
Your Honor,
illness.
I'm going to object to continuing to read this. I think it's improper if the witness knows what it is.
How much longer is it?
Well, Your Honor, it's about half a page.
I'm going to
How
object.
much is it?
I've read 2 paragraphs. I'm going to read the as components of malingering.
I'm going to object to her reading it at all. If the witness is familiar with the components, there's no reason to read it.
Objection.
It goes on to say malingering should be strongly suspected if any combination of the following is noted. 1, medical legal context of presentation, e.g., the person's being referred by his or her attorney to the physician for examination. Erik Menendez was referred to you by his attorney, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Number 2, marked discrepancy between the person's claimed stress or disability and the objective findings. Number 3, lack of cooperation during the diagnostic evaluation and in complying with the prescribed treatment regimen. And 4, the presence of antisocial personality disorder. Now, did you consider the fact that Erik Menendez might be malingering in representing facts to you when you were?
I'm going to object to the form of the question, Your Honor. Malingering apparently has to do with representing symptoms.
Objection overruled.
Did you consider the fact in your evaluation of Erik Menendez that he was malingering?
No, I didn't consider that in my evaluation because I had already been presented with a number of facts from other sources that Erik had been abused as a child and had that his parents were domineering, they were forceful, they were terrorizing, they had people in the community afraid of them, they had their own family afraid of them. They had all the qualities of abusive family. And when the stories that came out piece by piece, or the incidents that some of them were from Erik, some were from other members of the family, that didn't sound like malingering to me. It sounded like child abuse.
One of the things that you considered, though, was his father's treatment of him, correct? And one
Yes,
of the
his
things-
father's treatment
Yes,
of him.
and you also considered the sexual component of that, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. Given the conference we just had.
Objection sustained.
So it's your testimony that the fact that Erik Menendez lied to the authorities and lied to his family has no bearing on your opinion about whether or not he was abused, correct?
No, it has no bearing on my opinion that this child was, this boy this young man as a child was abused.
Okay. Now, you understand that at the time that you saw him, he was not a child, correct?
What's your definition of a child? Counsel?
Well, I'm not the expert. What is a child?
Well, it depends on what you chronologically, psychologically, emotionally, mentally.
Well, would you agree that nationwide 18 is recognized as the age of majority?
Well, I wouldn't agree because in some states it's 16, and I understand in Tennessee it's 12.
All right. Well, the general rule is that at 18 it's the age of majority. It's the age that we draft young men and send them to die for their country,
I'm
correct?
going to object. The form of the question is argumentative.
18 is the age at which we draft young men and send them to die for their
I'm
country.
going to object that we draft them to send them to die.
Correct?
The draft age is 18.
Yes.
The draft age is 18.
When did you first examine Erik Menendez? What month and what year?
It was 1992, and I believe it was in March of 1992.
And prior to interviewing Erik Menendez for the first time in March of 1992, what information had you been given about this case?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Give me,
You're asking for the detailed information?
No, I'm asking- the nature, generically. Were you given police reports?
Prior to the time that I saw Erik,
Yes.
no, I was not. I don't believe so. Just a minute, let me think. I had a lot of information, police reports, pictures, family albums, school reports, medical reports, and I saw Erik in and around that same time. And I've been given information all along in the last year and a half.
And that information has all come from his attorneys, correct?
Well, from his attorneys, from the schools, from his coaches, from the family members, from friends. That's correct.
Aside from Erik Menendez, who else did you interview personally?
I personally interviewed Lyle Menendez.
Anybody else?
No, nobody else.
So everybody else from whom you got information to corroborate the defendant were reports that you were provided by the defense. Is that correct?
Well, there were reports that were provided by the defense, but I think I need to tell you that I also consulted with other professionals who have been involved in the case who have had access to some of the individuals who have interviewed some of the family members. And so I've had an opportunity to consult with other professionals in my field.
But as far as personal interviews that you have conducted in this case, it would be Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez,
That's
correct?
correct.
How much time did you spend with Lyle Menendez?
About 3 hours.
And what kinds of
that.
subject matters did you cover with him?
Objection calls for hearsay.
Just in general, question.
Yes. What are the subject matters without the details? Were you talking about childhood experiences? Did you talk about the crime? What were you talking about?
We talked about the family system. We talked about what it was like to grow up with Jose Menendez and Mary Louise Menendez as parents, and what it was like to have a little brother like Erik.
So you were talking about interfamily relationships.
Interfamily relationships, I was.
Did you review any psychiatric records or psychological records of Erik Menendez?
I did.
And could you tell me which records you reviewed?
I reviewed, well, the most recent ones are the ones from the Lewis School. I reviewed his PDS records. I reviewed some of the early school records. I reviewed some testing on him that was done. I don't know who the psychologist was, but he'd had a WISCAR performed, which would indicate what his intellectual quotient was.
Do you recall the results of that?
Yes, he was in the above average range of intelligence.
Do you know what percentile he would have been in?
Probably about, it was not quite one standard deviation above the mean, I believe. So it would be not quite at the 84th percentile, maybe the 82nd percentile in terms of native ability.
Was that, were those records from Dr. Maloney?
I believe they were. He also did a number of other tests, and certainly would be the one to be able to give you the results of the other tests.
Did you give him any tests?
I didn't. I gave him some informal projectives. I had him draw a picture of a person. I had him draw a picture of the opposite sex of the person. I had him draw a picture of his family doing an activity, those kinds of things. I talked to him, did a moral judgment interview to see what his thinking was, if he could determine right from wrong, if he had feelings of remorse, those kinds of things, informal kinds of interviewing techniques.
Okay, so you didn't,
Paper and pencil things, nothing standardized.
all right, so you didn't give him the MMPI test.
No, I did not.
Did you evaluate, or did you look at the notes from Dr. Oziel in your evaluation?
I'm going to object to the form of the question vague. What notes?
Did you look at any, did you listen to any tape recordings from Dr. Oziel?
No, I haven't had any of Dr. Oziel's tape recordings.
Were you aware of the fact that Erik Menendez was being treated by a psychologist at or near the time of his parents' death?
Yes, I was made aware of
Psychologist, right?
that in some of the information that I was given. And I also saw that on television in Salt Lake City, Utah, because Dr. Oziel was on TV.
Whatever you think of Dr. Oziel, don't you think that it was important to get a hold of his notes to decide if they had any value to it?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this and ask to approach.
All right, let's clarify something. You said you saw Dr. Oziel on TV?
I saw Dr. Oziel on TV. Well, he was on some talk show being interviewed by someone, and it didn't have anything to do with his treatment of this boy. And so it's not really relevant to this testimony. Only that I know that he treated Erik and that he has been on national TV.
Okay, so you were aware of the fact that Erik Menendez was being treated by a psychologist around the time of his parents'
Your Honor, I'm
deaths.
going to object to this line of questioning and ask to approach.
All right, you may do so. All right.
Were you provided with all of Dr. Oziel's notes of his sessions with Erik Menendez?
I was not.
Now, I believe you indicated yesterday that you've testified in court a number of times. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's on the issue of psychological maltreatment or other kinds of child abuse.
That's on child abuse generically.
Okay.
And this is considered part of that.
So when you,
If you'll remember, I said psychological maltreatment is believed to be the core issue of all kinds of maltreatment, physical, sexual, emotional. It's what it does to the child. It's the messages that it conveys to a child.
but in your testimony, you testified basically to verbal maltreatment by the parents, correct?
In my
And-
testimony here,
Yeah,
I've talked about other things besides verbal. I've
But-
talked about the terrorization that occurred
and neglect.
and neglect. I
But
think
we're
I've
not
talked
talk-
about a variety of abuse,
Okay, but we're-
beatings.
Now, have you ever, let me ask you this. How much are you getting paid for your work?
There
on this
it
case?
is.
Your Honor, just court-appointed.
Overall,
722, sorry. How much are you getting paid?
I'm getting paid $50 an hour for travel time and $100 an hour for my work.
And that's including your testimony?
That's including my testimony.
Okay, and how many hours have you put in on this case so far?
About 130. Plus, I haven't counted up the number of hours that I've spent here, nor the number of hours that I've spent within the last 10 days reading the transcripts of the trial. So there'll be considerably more by the time I tally up what it took to read those 12,600 or 13,000 pages.
All right, so that's only so far,
That's
excluding the trial testimony that you've read, correct?
excluding the trial testimony and excluding the preparation time that I spent once the trial started. I've not tallied that up.
And part of your practice over the last several years, have you ever done evaluations of adult survivors or adult victims of child abuse?
Oh, yes, I have.
And you treat those people,
I
correct?
treat those people. I treat children and adults,
Okay. You al-
survivors of sexual abuse.
I believe you also have done evaluations of entire families, correct?
That's correct.
And one of the things that's useful in evaluating an entire family is to talk to everyone in the family.
Well, I try to talk to as many people as are made available to me. Of course, in this case, the Menendez, I couldn't interview because they weren't alive to interview, but I interviewed as many or read the transcripts of as many people who had known them in their life and had known about how they parented these kids. That was the information that I could get.
Don't you consider it valuable, though, in doing an evaluation to actually speak to the people who are alleged to be the abusers?
Why didn't you do a seance? Why didn't you talk to the parents in this case? Don't you think it would have been valuable? That's what that question kind of sounds like.
Well, sometimes it's valuable, but sometimes it isn't valuable. When I'm asked to do an evaluation of a child, I very often see only the child and see other members of the family if I can get information, but I'm not often asked to evaluate both the child and the perpetrator. No, that's not correct. Usually someone else evaluates the perpetrator, but my interest is looking at the child individually, intrapsychically, and then how that child relates to his system, family system, community system,
And if
school system.
And if you're evaluating the child within the family system, as you did in this case, it is helpful, is it not, to talk to the parents?
I don't talk to the parents if it's a case of child abuse.
All right, so when is it that you do talk to the parents? In what situation would you evaluate the parents?
If I were asked to do a total family assessment, if the court wanted me to do a family assessment of, for instance, custody evaluations where there has been some problem, I of course, very definitely evaluate both parents. But in cases of psychological maltreatment, it depends on what the assignment is. In this particular assignment, I was asked to look at all the material that was given to me and to, as was the task force that looked at this case, and give an opinion on the likelihood of these children having been psychologically maltreated. That was what I was asked to do, and that's what I evaluated.
All right, so that was your sole function, was to see whether or not they had been
Psychologically maltreated, and how that would impact specifically Erik's perception of life, of the messages that were conveyed to this child about who he was, how valuable he was, and was he on his own or an extension of a parent. Those are the kinds of things we look at in psychological maltreatment. That's part of the definition. Was he terrorized? Was he exploited? Was he isolated? Was he denied emotional responsiveness? Was he denied help when he needed it? Did he get the protection that he needed from a parent when he was hurt? Those are the kinds of things that I was asked to evaluate.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you found significant was that Erik Menendez had been denied medical attention and also educational attention to his specific problems during the course of his life. Is that correct?
Denied medical attention in that he, I know, has 2 scars which required suturing and they were never sutured.
Did you have an opportunity to review his medical records, his pediatric medical records in this case?
I reviewed them.
Okay. Did you notice, for instance, did you review the medical records of the pediatric group, which was located on Lucas Road in Princeton, New Jersey?
I can't remember what the specifics.
May I approach, please, Your Honor? Yes. I'm going to show you a document. This is one of the documents you were given by the defense attorney in this case. This is a typed, these are doctor's notes which have been transcribed into typewriting so that they can be read. Do you recognize these somewhat indecipherable notes?
Well, that's what I was given.
All right.
Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this typed in.
Okay, now,
Transcription of office notes.
yes.
Hurt posterior pharynx. That I didn't realize that he had, go into detail as to what the
Well-
history of this was, how
Why
that
don't you just,
happened?
don't ask the
I
question.
have a
Just read it if
question for
you
you.
want to.
Okay. No, my question is, were you shown the notes from the pediatric group in Princeton, New Jersey by the defense?
I was the handwritten notes, but not this.
Okay.
But
All
now
right.
that I see this, I have some more questions about what happened to this child.
Well, when you say you have more questions about what happened to the child, are you telling me that you reviewed these notes, but you didn't notice them?
Well, as you can see, they're very difficult to read, and what I could pick up was that he had strep throat and he had a mole on
Okay.
a leg and so forth. But I didn't see this.
All right, let me ask you some questions. It appears that from these notes that he was taken to the doctor by someone in December of 77, in April of 78, in August of 78, in June of 78, in January of 79, August of 1980. It appears he's got 3 visits. He's got a visit.
Oh, I see what you're getting at. Well,
Someone took him to the doctor.
I think Mrs. Menendez probably took him for, he had a lot of strep throat, and he had throat cultures and those kinds of things.
Here he's got an infected, ingrown left great toe. This was on,
Oh, I'm aware of that because I remember Erik telling me that, as a matter of fact, that had to do with a very painful procedure, and he had steeled himself not to cry because he wanted his mother to report to his father that he'd had the procedure and that he was brave and hadn't cried, and he was very disappointed and hurt that that report wasn't made. Yes, I'm aware that mother took him to the doctor for those kinds of things.
yeah, my question to you is not whether or not he cried at one of these procedures, but whether or not he was taken. These medical records indicate
Look at all these times where she actually did take him to the doctor. Doesn't that mean that there was no abuse? I mean, she's definitely trying to call into question the idea that she neglected his medical needs so much. I would expect on redirect for Leslie then to come back and be like, okay, but can it be that there are a number of times when she did take him to the doctor, but there were a number of times that she didn't, and that those were severe enough that she was denying him medical treatment, which is, a form of abuse, et cetera, et cetera. I expect this to come up on redirect.
indicate, especially from this pediatric group, that he was actually taken to the doctor by someone, correct? On many occasions.
He was taken to the doctor, as far as I can tell, for physical things. I don't know that he was ever taken to the doctor for psychological things.
Well, but he was taken to Dr. Oziel.
Huh.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overall.
But he was taken to Dr. Oziel. Don't you realize that's the same thing as going to any good psychologist?
Are aware of the
Wasn't
fact
taken to Dr. Oziel.
Counsel, that's not.
you are aware of the fact that Erik Menendez was sent to Dr. Oziel.
I know that Erik went to Dr. Oziel. He told me about Dr. Oziel.
Okay, so you just said that you weren't aware that he was given psychological treatment, and yet you also are aware of the fact that he went to Dr. Oziel.
He went
Let's get her opinion of Dr. Oziel. I want to hear it. I really want to hear her opinion of him.
to Dr. Oziel, and I don't know about Dr. Oziel's tapes and Dr. Oziel's notes. All I know is that Erik was taken there because of some acting out, and Dr. Oziel had Erik sign something which allowed Dr. Oziel to tell the parents everything that Erik told him. That's about the extent of my knowledge of Dr. Oziel
Okay,
and
well,
psychological treatment.
That wasn't my question, but you are aware of the fact that he did receive psychological treatment, correct?
I'm going to object to the form of the question, but since that's not in evidence.
Correct?
He went to Dr. Oziel for what? I'm not sure it was psychological treatment. I would have to see Dr. Oziel's notes and know what Dr. Oziel's diagnosis was and what the nature of the therapy was. And
But you weren't given those notes, right?
no, I was not given those notes, not been privy to Dr. Oziel's notes.
Now, you indicated that he had to go to see Dr. Oziel because of some
It
acting
doesn't matter because he didn't take regular notes anyway.
out. Is that
That was my understanding, that his parents were concerned that he was beginning to assert some of his independence, and they wanted help with that. Or I'm not sure what they wanted.
Okay, what do you mean when you say assert his independence? What, you just use the term assert his independence. What do you mean by
Well, I'm
that?
aware that Erik had been involved in two neighborhood adolescent burglaries, or one with his brother and one with a friend at
And what,
two of the neighborhood homes.
do you know, what do you mean by an adolescent burglary? How is that different from
He was with his brother on one occasion, and he was with a friend on one occasion, and he did this as an adolescent.
Were you aware of the value of the property that was taken in one of those?
I think that was worth a lot of money. There were some items that they took. I don't know specifically. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it because I placed it within the context of Erik's life and his age. And
So you didn't consider the fact that he took approximately $80,000 to $100,000?
object to that, Your Honor.
Overall.
You didn't consider the fact that he took about $80,000 or $100,000 worth of property to be significant? You thought that was just like an adolescent prank?
well, it was an adolescent acting out behavior. Indeed, it was.
Well,
Certainly wasn't right.
Is there any reason that it wasn't criminal behavior?
Criminal behavior.
Yes.
Well, it was. I guess if he had been an adult, it would have been considered. What is that? You tell me. You're the lawyer. A felony? Is it considered?
Yes, it's residential burglary. It's considered
Residential
a
burglary.
serious felony in this state.
Yeah. And he was
You tell me, you're the lawyer.
underage, so I'm not sure. Was he charged? What
was-
he was charged with?
It's still a residential burglary. The punishment is different. Okay.
I'm going to object to that, Your Honor. Juvenile
All
court
right,
is telling me to-
again, just state your legal objection.
Well, it assumes facts not in evidence,
All right,
improper question.
the objection is sustained to the form of the question. It's argumentative. Please raise the question.
So, ma'am, in considering the burglary and the grand theft in which he participated, in your own mind, you decided that that was something that was attributable not to his own volition, but something that just happened. Is that right?
Actually, what I attribute it to, if you want to know the honest truth, after I'd looked at the history of this child and the parenting of this child, I saw that as a plea for help. I often see this with children who have been in an abusive situation. And it's like, look, I've done this and nobody's responded. I've cried and nobody's responded. I don't do well in school and nobody's responded. Now I've got the attention, don't I? And that's an unconscious kind of a motivation. But I see this in kids. I see this in adolescents.
Were you aware that he purchased walkie-talkies before the crime to perfect the crime?
Objection, Your Honor. Assumes facts not in evidence, and I'd like to approach.
All right, you may do that.
Now, ma'am, were you aware of the fact that Erik Menendez indicated that he used money he had stolen in the first grand theft to purchase certain articles that he used in the second burglary? Were you aware of that?
Mrs. Pizanich,
My question is simple. Were you aware of that information? Yes or no?
I was asked to perform an evaluation if psychological maltreatment had occurred, and I performed that evaluation. Now, as far as these burglaries that occurred, I didn't go into all the detail on that. I was aware that they occurred, and I put that in the context of adolescent behavior and not as part of the psychological maltreatment evaluation.
Were you aware?
So, Matt, go ahead.
Were you aware of the fact that some of the items taken included a grandfather clock, a Soloflex, and a computer?
Relevance.
Were you aware of that?
I was aware that there were items taken, and I was also aware that they were items that
Oh, oh no. Buffering. Why are we buffering? Come on. Oh no. Like this all should have been totally loaded up. I don't know why this is buffering. This is definitely getting heated. And it doesn't feel relevant to this person's testimony to be getting into the details of the grand theft. I mean, that technically is what it is. That's why she's allowed to call it that. But of course, you know, I don't necessarily begrudge the prosecution for, oh, what is happening?
A breaking
There we
point.
go. Okay. So I don't necessarily begrudge the prosecution for pushing and continuing to push and calling it a grand theft and calling it this and calling it that, because that's their right to zealously advocate for their side. But I will say, I feel like it's at this point she's getting into non-relevant territory.
Have you ever done any study of what percentage of the criminal population has been psychologically maltreated?
No, I think that's irrelevant.
Overall.
Have you ever done any studies, or are you aware of any studies that deal with the percentage of people who are criminals in the criminal justice system who've been psychologically maltreated?
I'm going to object to the use of the term criminal as being utterly meaningless.
Rephrase the question.
Have you ever seen or have you ever done any studies dealing with the percentage of people who've been adjudged criminals by a court by being found guilty or pleading guilty who were the victims of psychological maltreatment?
I'm going to object to that question as well. It's too vague and too broad, and no one is a judged criminal. It's simply guilty or innocent.
Objection overruled. Do you understand the question?
Would you ask it again, please?
All right, let's have it right back.
Question, have you ever seen or have you done any studies dealing with the percentage of people who have been adjudged criminals by the court by being found guilty or pleading guilty who were the victims of psychological maltreatment?
No,
So you're not aware of any such studies?
no.
Would you assume?
Psychological maltreatment is a relatively new and discrete form of abuse. So I don't believe there are any studies, not to my knowledge.
In your expert opinion, would you say that most criminals probably have been psychologically maltreated?
Objection, Your Honor, that calls for speculation.
Let's phrase it another way. Do you have any opinions about that matter, one way or another?
About criminals being psychologically maltreated?
By their caregivers as children?
I don't have that information.
Do you have an opinion, though?
Do I have an opinion? I'd need more data. I'd need a lot more data. I'd need to know what happened to each and every one of those individuals in their life,
Good answer.
what their parents were like.
I believe you indicated that one of the things you found significant is that Erik Menendez did not receive the educational care that he needed, correct? And that was based partly on the report that you received yesterday from the Lewis School?
By educational care, there had been recommendations made by teachers along the way to Mr. and Mrs. Menendez that had not been followed through on. That's what I meant.
But there were some things they did follow through on, weren't there?
Erik went to school when he wasn't playing tennis, or he was sent to school. His mother did his homework for him. Actually, she helped him quite a bit, if you call that help, in his later years, in order for him to get good grades and to be able to get into college. I don't mean to minimize Erik's own ability, but he never really had an opportunity to show what he could do because it was done for him in those later years. I do know that.
Now, the report that you got yesterday was from a school called the Lewis School, correct?
Yes,
And
I've
that-
just had an opportunity to look at that yesterday.
And the Lewis School was not his regular high school, was it?
The Lewis School is a school that offers tutorial services and extensive psychological testing.
All right, and it's your understanding that he was found to have certain learning disorders by being diagnosed at the Lewis School, correct?
He was 15 and a half years old, so there are a couple of things of note here.
Wait, my question is, the Lewis School did in fact diagnose him as having certain disorders.
They were able to diagnose some mechanical problems in Erik's learning. They were not permitted to diagnose any psychological issues. They were not allowed to give him those tests.
But they were
allowed to give him tests that had to do with his ability to write and to read and perform math computation.
if the Menendez parents were not getting specialized treatment for Erik Menendez, then do you know how he found his way to the Lewis School?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
The Lewis School was not his regular high school, correct?
Asked and answered.
Overall.
Is that correct?
The Lewis School is a school that you can take a child to get help, tutorial kind of help for remediation. And in that school, I read the letter yesterday, the Menendez allowed the school to give him a RAT, W-R-A-T, which is a test to see how the child performs. And he was allowed to be given that. He was not given further psychological testing, which would have been necessary. And it's surprising they went ahead and tutored him without that, all of that information. But they did, I think, do it for several weeks.
So
Tutored him,
he did-
gave him some tutorial help in math.
So he did receive some tutorial help.
He had 3 weeks, I think.
Were you aware of the fact that when he was at Beverly Hills High School, he was also tutored by a private company?
Yes, he did have tutoring then, yes.
Okay, so it is.
Again, the emphasis was on performance, not why is this child not performing, but let's bring him up to speed so that he can be a good student. Performance orientation, again, part of the pattern.
So when you say that he was denied educational needs, he was not totally denied educational needs, was he?
He was given bits and pieces, of course he was.
Well, then-
You have to look at the whole picture, and that's what I keep coming back to, is it's a pattern.
May I approach, please? I'm going to show you some other records which have been provided to me by the defense.
I could use more water.
Let me ask, does
We'll
anyone
take
need
a
a break?
I do.
Okay. We have one taker. Okay. All right, let's take a recess. We'll resume at 10 minutes after the hour.
She's got her sense of
Everybody
humor.
is here.
I mean,
We're ready to resume.
despite the fact that this is a very contentious cross-examination, and she's giving it right back to Pam. She she's holding her sense of humor. She's definitely very confident. She's doing very well, in
Resume.
my opinion.
Okay. You may continue your cross-examination.
You might want to pull the mic in front of you. Ma'am, in evaluating the facts of this case, did you by any chance interview their paternal grandmother, Erik Menendez's paternal grandmother? That is Maria Menendez.
No, I believe I gave you all of my sources.
Okay, so you didn't interview her,
I didn't
correct?
interview Maria Menendez.
Now, I believe before the break you indicated that you considered the grand theft and burglary that Erik Menendez committed to be acting out behavior or a cry for help. Is that correct?
Yes, I looked at it within the context of the boys, Eric's behavior from childhood up. I looked at it to see if this was a pattern, and it was not. It appeared to be an adolescent kind of behavior.
In your mind, what is the difference between adolescent acting out and criminal behavior?
This was asked and answered.
Overall. That's your question.
Adolescent acting out can be a variety of things. It can be stealing. It can be doing something to show. Well, all adolescents act out. Basically, there's a tremendous difference between adolescent acting out and criminal behavior.
But not all adolescent acting out is criminal behavior, correct?
Well, not all adolescent acting out is criminal behavior, no, but I'd be willing to say that all adolescents, at least most of the ones that I've worked with, do act out. And if they don't, then
Right. And
it's unusual.
one of the ways that adolescents act out is they'll wear clothes or a hairstyle that it particularly irritates their parents, right?
Well, again, it operates on a continuum. There are all different kinds of forms of,
Okay. But
of
that-
adolescents showing their independence and doing things that they shouldn't be doing, certainly.
Do you think that dyeing your hair purple and shaving it off is the same as committing a burglary?
Objection, Your Honor, is irrelevant.
Overall.
I mean, do you think that's the,
Argumentative.
Sustained.
Yeah,
Your question.
argumentative.
would you agree that there are degrees of adolescent acting out?
That's what she said. There's a spectrum.
There are degrees of behavior, all kinds of behavior. I'm
I have no quarrel with that. I'm just saying that I viewed these burglaries that Erik was involved in as not a serious indicia that he was on his way to criminal behavior. I felt this was part of his adolescent period.
So you didn't think that he was on his way to criminal behavior? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that he was not on his way to criminal behavior. He was not going to con people. He was not going to be a con artist. I saw this, once again, as part of his adolescent period.
And
I did not see it. I can't make more of it. I can't make less of it.
So when he went to the police shortly after the death of his parents and he told the police a story about where he'd been that night, he was not acting as a con artist. Is that
I'm
correct?
sorry, I'm not following you.
Okay. You're aware of the fact that shortly after calling 911 that Erik went to the police station and told a story about what he'd done that night, which did not involve admitting he'd been involved in the crime.
That's correct.
Right.
I'm aware of that.
And you're aware of the fact that he told several people that he had not been involved in the crime and in fact diverted attention to other people.
Objection, Your Honor, compound.
Overall.
You're aware of that, correct?
I object to the last part of the question is assuming facts not in evidence.
Overall.
State the question again, please.
You're aware of the fact that Erik told other people not only that he wasn't involved in the crime, but diverted attention to other potential suspects.
Again, I object that that assumes facts not in evidence.
Overall.
Do you understand my question?
No, I don't, because I don't understand what that has to do with where we were with psychological maltreatment.
You just said you didn't think he was on his way to becoming a con artist, and I'm asking you about instances in which he lied. Okay? Do you understand now?
Well, I understand that you're saying that Erik lied about where he was the night of.
Well, are you familiar with a transcript of a tape that was made on November the 29th of 1989 at a Gladstone's restaurant?
The idea that because he lied once, yes, in a serious case, yes, it's a serious lie, but that makes him a con artist is just a little bit mind boggling. I'm not going to lie. That is more than a stretch.
Were you given that?
I may have been given it. I don't remember it. You could give it to me now and I refresh my memory, but I don't know what your question is.
Okay.
The Gladstone
Are you
tape?
aware of the fact that in late November of 1989, that Erik Menendez had a conversation with his friend Craig Signorelli, which was tape recorded by the Beverly Hills Police Department? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that during that conversation, Erik Menendez told his friend Craig Signorelli that there were serious hitmen involved in the death of his parents?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm going to object to quoting that tape totally out of context.
Overall. Your answer.
I heard about that, I believe it was day before yesterday, from Erik himself in this courtroom.
You heard about it because you either witnessed or read the cross-examination by Mr. Kuriyama of Mr. Menendez, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And in that particular conversation, he was in fact diverting attention away from himself as the killer onto others, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, that is argumentative.
Overall.
Actually, the question doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Would you repeat it?
When Erik Menendez said that serious hitmen were involved in the death of his parents, he was not admitting that he'd done it himself, correct?
That's correct. And as I remember it,
That was my,
Could the witness answer the
excuse me,
Well, she had, next question, please.
and in fact, by saying that serious hitmen were involved, he was elaborating on the lie, wasn't he?
he was trying to, as I understand it, as Erik described it, he was trying to get Craig Signorelli away from
The truth.
well, or wanting to keep pushing him.
He was trying to keep Craig Signorelli away from the truth,
Objection, argumentative.
Overall.
correct? I mean, the truth was he killed his parents, right?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
All right. And when he was talking to Craig Signorelli, he was not only denying involvement, but trying to say that hitmen had done the crime, correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Overall.
I don't know. I don't know how you want me to answer this. I'm trying to answer to the best of my ability. I understand that what you're saying. I don't understand what this has to do.
Well,
with-
regardless of whether it's a question you think should be asked, just if you understand the question, you should answer it.
Do you understand my question?
You asked me if I was aware that Erik lied. Yes, I'm aware that Erik lied.
Okay. Well, there are degrees of lying, wouldn't you agree? There's lying to protect yourself, and then there's other kinds of lying.
There's
right?
all kinds of lying.
Right. Okay. And you indicated that you felt that these crimes that he committed in Calabasas did not indicate that he was going to become a con man, correct?
I indicated that based on the history of this child, this boy, this adolescent, that the 2 burglaries that I knew about were not significant in terms of what was going to happen next. That's correct. I'm saying that this is a child who's been badly psychologically maltreated. That is the essence of my testimony.
Do you believe that he's a child sitting here today in court?
Again, I would have to ask you to define what you mean by child. I think that emotionally, yes. I think I see 30-year-olds, I see 40-year-olds who are emotionally children.
Do you think that excuses their conduct? Do you think the fact that children excuses?
I think that if you have lived in a family where you have been terrorized, you have been subjected to horrible things, you have had nobody to protect you, you have no one inside the family or outside the family to get help from, then I think you have been terribly maltreated.
And do you think
And
do you think that excuses?
Had you finished your answer?
And I think that when you have been subjected to a life of terror and you live in a family with very powerful figures that everybody else is afraid of in the outside world, then you are boxed in. You are terrorized. You are afraid. And I think based on that kind of maltreatment, it's got to affect a child's emotions, a child's ability to organize, a child's behaviors. Everything that happens to us can affect us. And I think this is very significant.
Do you think it excuses criminal conduct? What is your personal belief? Do you think that kind of
Object, Your Honor. Her personal belief is not an issue here. She's here to testify to her expert opinion.
All right, you didn't object to this question when it was asked before. It's being asked now.
And I woke up. I'm
Okay,
objecting now.
well, she gave a long answer, and now she's being asked the question again. And what is your answer?
do you think it excuses criminal conduct?
I don't know what you're referring to as criminal conduct.
Killing your parents in a premeditated fashion.
I'm not aware that the killing of the parents was premeditated.
I'm asking you hypothetically.
Well, I'm going to object that it's irrelevant hypothetically.
Overall.
Are you asking me if I think this child had a right?
No, I'm asking you hypothetically. Do you think that abused children should be excused from their conduct if they commit premeditated murders? That's what I'm asking you.
That's such a broad question that she could properly answer this question by saying it depends on the circumstances. It could honestly depend on the circumstances.
Ms. Bosanich, I think that cannot be answered hypothetically. I think I would have to consider every single individual case.
There you
I would
go.
have to know as much as I could know
There you go.
about the treatment
There you
of
go.
this child.
All right, then in this particular case, do you think that the child abuse excuses criminal conduct?
I'm going to object to the form of the question, Your Honor. It assumes an ultimate fact that the jury has yet to decide, which is whether this was criminal conduct.
Did you want to restate the question, or do you want to pursue it as a statement?
I want to pursue it as a statement.
Objection overruled.
Did you understand my question?
I'm assuming that the jury is here to learn all they can learn about what we have to tell. And I'm assuming that they are the triers of fact and they will make that determination. It is not for me. I am here to present what I know about the life of this boy.
Are you saying that you will not answer my question?
I'm saying I cannot answer your question because I think it's not right. I think that is in the trier of fact needs to make that determination.
Would you say then that your personal experiences and your personal views have no bearing on the way you're testifying in this case?
I'm sorry, my personal views?
Yeah, your personal views on life.
I have tried to be very objective about this evaluation, as I do about all evaluations. I have tried to look at the data as it is presented to me. So I can't give you a personal view on this particular matter. I think that the facts will speak for themselves, and the jury will decide that.
All right, so you are not going to answer my question.
I'm going to object to this as argumentative, Your Honor, and cite Penal Code Section 29. It's an improper
Sustained.
question.
Objection sustained. Go on to your next question.
There you
Now, I
go.
believe you indicated in your direct examination that one of the things that you found about Mrs. Menendez is that she denied medical needs to her son, Erik Menendez. And I'd like to approach and show you some medical records. May I approach?
Again?
Yes.
Didn't she already do this?
I'd like to ask you if you have seen this particular document that I'm showing you and the ensuing testing data.
Oh, please let them be Dr. Oziel's notes. Please let them be Dr. Oziel's notes.
Having some difficulty in Spanish, teacher thought he might have auditory processing problem. Yes, I'm aware of this. And he in fact had some testing and was, the family was informed that Erik in fact had an auditory processing problem, that his hearing was, the hearing acuity was all right. I'm not aware of any subsequent treatment, however, following the auditory processing that when he was 13 and a half.
Well, I think you indicated that his processing was okay.
No, that mistakes the testimony. She said hearing acuity is okay.
Okay, his hearing acuity.
His hearing acuity, I believe, was adjudged accurate. And I know that there was some actual degrading that went on of the child by his mother subsequent to that testing, in that she would say to Erik, I know you can hear all right. What's wrong with you?
The only question I just asked you was, were you aware of this report, right?
Objection argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
Ma'am, I just asked you if you were
I
aware.
object to the counsel referring to Dr. Tyler as man as disrespectful.
All right.
Oh man, I think Pam is starting to lose her cool here. I definitely think she's starting to lose her cool. She's having a hard time with this witness.
Just objection overruled. You may ask your next question.
I just asked you if you were aware of that report.
I'm aware of that report.
All right. Now, you're not an advocate, is that correct?
An advocate?
An advocate for one side or the other.
That's correct.
Now, I'd like to ask you, have you looked at the medical reports here, which come under the heading of Dr. Jane Cheng, Cheng? Did you review her medical reports of Erik Menendez?
I can't read these, of course, because it's illegible. And I read that he had diarrhea.
Okay, now,
Maybe you can interpret this for me. If you can read it, he had a cold and a cough and diarrhea and some childhood kinds of things.
well, it appears that he was taken to the doctor, and would you agree with me? He was taken to the doctor on the 9th of February of 1971, on the 12th of February of 71. He was taken on April 9th of 71, April 19th of 71, June 24th of 71, July 12th of 71,
I'm going to object to this as irrelevant.
Overruled.
August 27th of 71, the 29th of October of 71, the 7th of December of 71, and on and on and on.
Yes, I'm aware that
Object to on and on and on, Your Honor, is an improper question.
All right, January
Well,
20th.
why don't you just show it to her so she can see all the dates and see it.
Pam is definitely losing her cool here. This is Pam having a hard time. Oh my God. And also look at Dr. Tyler's face right here. She's having a great time.
it's irrelevant, actually, for my testimony. I am aware that
Again, she just asked, did you see all those entries?
I did.
Okay, and it's irrelevant. What is irrelevant about the fact that Mrs. Menendez took her son to the doctor?
I know that Mrs. Menendez took her son to the doctor, and she took her son to get some testing. What I also know is that she did not appear to be interested in getting the help for Erik that he needed. For instance, with the auditory processing problem, it was diagnosed, and then because being labeled with a learning disability was not okay in this family. As a matter of fact, what's really I find quite ironic is that I see these problems that are identified with this child, but I find it unusual that the family, the outside family, knows nothing about it. Nobody else in the family outside of Kitty Menendez and Jose Menendez knew that Erik had a learning disability at any time. That was a surprise to them. Nobody knew that Erik was making, I think, straight 4s, which is like a D, prior to the time that Kitty Menendez took him to the Lewis School to get some help to bring his math grade up. And that so that it appears as if this is a mother who cared about her child. I think this is a mother who cared about the image.
And that's why she took her son to the doctor for diarrhea, because she cared about her image?
She took her son to the doctor for diarrhea because it probably didn't matter to her. I mean, that doesn't destroy a mother's image if your kid has diarrhea, but it apparently was very distasteful to her or embarrassing to her or dishonoring to her to have a child who wasn't perfect, a child who had a learning disability, a child who had problems with memory, those kinds of things. And what's really I guess was alarming to me when I looked at those records, that particularly those Lewis School records, that Mrs. Menendez was unwilling to have complete psychological battery done. And there, I don't have the information there, but and it's new to me, and you may want to read it aloud, but I thought it was quite amazing that the further psychological help was not given, because I think there was some information that I saw that would have been alarming and would have need to have followed through on.
Did you ever consider the possibility that Mr. and Mrs. Menendez did not tell other people about their child's disability so as not to embarrass the child? Did you ever even consider that?
Which also would be stigmatizing to the child, because if you normalize it to the kid, you normalize it by talking about it with people, then the kid understands I have a disability and it is not a problem. It's okay to talk about. It's not something that makes me less than. Good Lord, Pam.
I'm just asking you, did you consider that?
That they didn't tell the family that their child had a learning disability?
So as not to
embarrass the child? I don't see that at all. I think they did not tell the family because there was this pattern of wanting to have a child who could perform, a child who did well in tennis, a child who did well in soccer, a child who could swim, a child who could make straight A's. And Erik couldn't do any of these, of course, but he had to lie to his relatives he was told to lie to his relatives about the grades he made.
You said Erik couldn't do any of those things. Actually, he was quite a good tennis player.
Erik could do all of those things. He could never do it to the perfection that the parents required.
Now, you were very critical of the fact that the Menendez parents did not get psychological testing for him after he was tested at the Lewis School.
Yes.
Okay. Did you ever consider the fact that maybe at that point in their lives, they didn't believe in the value of psychology? Did you consider that?
That's a possibility.
There are people like that in the world who don't see much value in psychology. Are you aware of that?
There are Christian Scientists who don't take their children to the doctors. Yes, I'm very aware of that.
Now, much of the information you got was from relatives of the defendants, correct?
I got my information from Erik, some from Lyle, from relatives, from friends of the family, business associates, coaches, and the records that were sent to me from the school, the teachers' reports. That is the source of my opinion on the psychological maltreatment.
Now, I believe that you indicated that you were asked yesterday if you could think of, I may have to say this wrong, and please excuse me, but something like you couldn't think of anything that Erik had told you or that you knew about that was good about Kitty Menendez. Now, that may be too large a paraphrase, but do you remember that? That you said you thought for a while and you said you couldn't come up with anything positive about her?
Well, objection, that wasn't the question. It had to do with nurturing or support.
Again, let's not argue the matter.
Mistakes.
That's the question. Do you remember that?
Would you repeat the question? Can you ask it as you asked it yesterday, or are you asking a new question today?
Okay, I'll rephrase the question. I believe you indicated, for instance, that Mrs. Menendez had never intervened on Erik's behalf. I believe that was your testimony.
That was my testimony. In these cases where the child was terrorized or very, very frightened, there was no record of intervention, no record of nurturing, no record of holding, no record of taking care of this child emotionally.
I take it you did read or you did view his direct examination by Ms. Abramson when he testified here in court,
Yes.
referring counsel to volume 96, page 16,092.
We don't have the transcript.
Oh, you probably memorized it, so that's okay.
No, actually, but I'm not concerned about it either, so counsel can read.
Okay. I noticed there was a pause, though, after I made that remark. Took you
Well, I
lost
wanted
for
to see
words.
if I knew it was on
Okay.
16,000 such and such, but it just slipped my mind.
All right, you may proceed.
Question by Ms. Abramson at line 19. Were there times when you were young when your father was ridiculing or berating you, when your mother would say a word or two? Answer by Erik Menendez. When I was young? Question. Would she do that? Answer. Yes. Okay. Do you remember seeing that testimony?
I don't remember it, but well, it obviously didn't impact me.
But you said
She said yes. The question was, did your mother say anything? Oh, I do remember. Yes, I do remember. Erik said sometimes she would say, Jose.
right. That was what I was going to reach.
That was the intervention.
Right. At page 16,093, the question, the testimony was that his mom would say Jose and he would just look at her and he would stop. He would stop. That was the testimony of Erik Menendez.
That Jose would stop?
Yes, Jose would stop his berating and ridiculing of Erik Menendez. Okay. So would you like to correct your recollection that you know of no times when she intervened on behalf of her son?
I think it's obvious that just what I repeated, that at times when Erik was asked if his mother intervened, sometimes his mother would say, Jose, and Jose would stop ridiculing.
Okay, but yes-
That's Erik's testimony, then it's Erik's testimony.
All right. So
I was talking about the big things, I think. I was talking about, the going into the cold bathtub when he was nightmaring, the real significant things.
I think actually what the testimony was is that he was sleepwalking and that she couldn't wake him up. I think that was the testimony.
Objection that he states the testimony.
All right, without saying what you think the evidence is, you can ask a question.
Do you remember that, in fact, the cold water was applied in order to wake him up?
Yes, that's correct. He was having night terrors and would sleepwalk.
Correct. And that she used
But
the
it was
cold...
associated with night terrors. And she would use cold water. She would dunk him in it. And that was the way that she chose to wake up this child.
Okay. And you find fault with that, correct?
I find that abusive.
Okay. You're aware of the fact that sometimes if people have too much to drink, they're thrown into a cold shower and it's turned on to them.
Comparing him to someone who has had too much to drink. I'm sorry, what?
To wake them up.
I think that's irrelevant in this case. This child wasn't drinking. He was a baby.
And
he
I'm
was
not
having night terrors.
I'm not suggesting that he was drinking, but I'm saying...
She was suggesting that, this would not be the way that I would address one of my child's night terrors. I would not put a child into a tub of cold water. I think most parents would agree with you, with me.
During his testimony, Erik Menendez testified that when he was younger, his mother seemed to care more about him than about Lyle. Do you remember that testimony?
I do
that he
remember
gave?
that.
Okay. So there must have been something good that happened while he was growing up.
Objection, I think that's calling for speculation.
Overall. But why don't you rephrase it so it's a question?
Was there, if in fact Erik Menendez made that statement, and in fact later on said one of the things he liked about his mother was her smile, would you deduce from that he had seen his mother smile?
Erik saw his mother smile.
Okay, and would you deduce from the fact that he came to the conclusion that his mother cared more for him than Lyle, that she did something positive to him?
Oh, no, I wouldn't conclude that at all. As a matter of fact, I would think that would be adding to the confusion in this child's life, that the mother wasn't equally caring for both of the children. And I think when you say,
And I say what? Are you finished with your answer?
I'm finished with my answer.
Right. Did you by any chance write a report in this case?
I did not.
Okay, is that your usual practice, not to write reports in cases where you're asked to evaluate people?
That is my usual practice. I take notes and I do an outline.
Oh, did you take notes?
I have my outline here.
All right. Would you provide that to the prosecution now that you've testified?
Yes. And I have the incidents that I recounted yesterday in the categories, and you can have all of that.
All right, thank you. Now, in the work that you've done and the literature that you've read, do you have an estimate of the percentage of the adult population which has been the victim of psychological abuse?
I don't have that estimate.
Okay. Now, I believe earlier I asked you about the criminal population. As to the general population, that is like everybody in this room.
Are you talking about the general statistics that are becoming better known and better known about the incidence of sexual abuse? Is that what your question is?
No, my question was psychological abuse.
Well, psychological abuse is, with using this definition, is the core of any kind of abuse. And so we would have to talk about, we could talk about the very general statistics, which are quite well published, about sexual abuse. We could talk about different states. I don't have all those statistics. I do have the California state statistics in terms of sexual abuse, psychological or emotional abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. I do have those with me.
All right. It would be fair to say that children who have been sexually abused are also at the same time psychologically abused, correct?
Yes, that's correct. They've been exploited, certainly at the very least.
Correct. So there is a psychological component to sexual abuse, correct?
Yes, there's a psychological component to all kinds of abuse.
But not all psychologically abused children have been sexually abused, correct?
That's correct.
And not all psychologically abused children are physically abused, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
There are different forms of abuse, and it operates on a continuum, and probably most of us as parents could put ourselves someplace along the continuum by virtue of being a parent. I'm talking about the very significant end of the continuum where the abuse has been severe and ongoing, and there's not been intervention.
Just in terms of pure psychological abuse, have you seen worse cases than Erik Menendez's?
Have I seen worse cases than Erik Menendez?
Yes.
A long pause.
This is a pretty bad case.
Have you ever seen cases where children were locked in closets for years at a time and starved to half their normal weight?
I've read about those cases.
All right. Then in terms of what you've read about, is this the worst case you've ever heard of?
Well, it depends. I mean, that's not a question that you can answer with a yes or a no. You have to take all of the data into consideration, and you have to look at what it has done over the years to the sense of this child of who he is and what he's worth.
And so in comparison to cases where maybe children have been locked in a closet inside their parents' home for 5 or 10 years and have
Most
never...
of those, the most severe cases, of course, are when the children die or when the children kill themselves. That sometimes happens too. And when it gets to the point of when a child has been terrorized and is so fearful and is so isolated, and their choices are very limited. I do see children sometimes kill themselves.
Now, to your knowledge, Erik Menendez was never locked in a closet for years at a time, correct?
Erik Menendez was locked in a closet, and that is a piece of the pattern that I was talking about yesterday and today.
Erik Menendez was not locked in a closet for years at a time, is that correct?
Erik Menendez was not locked in for years in a closet, not that I know of. That isn't a part of Erik Menendez's background.
Okay. He was not denied food, was he?
Well, he was forced to eat food that he had not wanted, and it was put in the garbage, and so he was fed. Erik was fed. He was clothed. He had a bed. He had the physical accoutrements that parents provide.
When a parent says to a child, "You're not leaving the dinner table till you eat your soup," do you consider that to be abuse?
Again, Ms. Bozanich, it's on a continuum.
If a parent always tells their child, "You're not going to leave the table till you finish your soup," is that abuse?
There is a difference between having your child take a bite of something or finish something and forcing the child until the child vomits. There's a big difference. So it's you can't compare the two. You're talking about parenting. And there are parents, all parents use those techniques. You need to stay at the table till you finish your soup.
Did you ever consider that any of the stories you were told were exaggerated in order to help Erik Menendez out of this bind that he's in?
Object to the formal question.
Rephrase the question.
Did you ever consider that any of the reports of this abuse were exaggerated in order to aid the defendant?
I didn't find that there was any exaggeration. I found it to be corroborated by a number of people, the kinds of abuse that Erik had.
Well, but how do you know those number of people didn't get together beforehand?
Oh, I'm going to object to that, Your Honor. It's calling for speculation.
Overruled.
How do you know the people didn't get together beforehand? You don't, do you?
Well, there wouldn't be any way to know that there'd been a meeting of the teachers and the coaches and the extended family and the people that have spoken here. There wouldn't be any way of knowing how, but I think that's highly...
The teachers and the coaches and the extended family, everybody got together. All of those witnesses got together. They had a general meeting. There were even minutes involved where they went through an agenda. Come on, man.
Improbable that there was ever a meeting of people saying, well, let's make up and exaggerate the facts of this boy's life.
Did you read Marta Cano's?
Dionysia Jaclo. Yeah, there definitely were snacks. There definitely were snacks at this meeting. Oh man. Okay, let's continue on.
Testimony from testifying here in this courtroom. Marta Cano.
Yes, I know who she is.
All right. Did you read the cross-examination that I did of her, wherein I asked her about lying?
I haven't had a chance to read the cross-examination of her.
Okay. If I were to tell you that Marta Cano indicated to me that she would lie for me, would that change your opinion as to the accuracy of the information you got from her?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the formal question.
Sustained.
There was no way for you to test whether or not Mrs. Marta Cano was a person who told the truth, was there?
I was not asked to do any tests like that. It's impossible to know anyway. There isn't anybody that can tell you if somebody's telling the truth or lying.
And even a lie detector test doesn't
Even a lie
tell you that.
detector test doesn't
Right.
stand up in court.
So you as a psychologist and as an expert witness have no magic way of telling if someone's telling the truth or not.
Oh, no, of course not.
All right.
No one does.
So when you are given an evaluation to do, you have to rely.
I have to rely on the information that's given to me, and I have to look at the total picture, which is what I keep coming back to, because I think any of this in isolation needs to be put in a context. And that's what I rely upon.
And when you looked at the total picture of Erik Menendez, I believe you indicated that the fact that he lied did not have any impact on your findings.
I took it into consideration. I take all of this into consideration.
And what value did you give it?
What value did I give the fact that Erik lied?
Yes.
I didn't give it any value in terms of his psychological maltreatment because it didn't pertain to what was happening to him in the home.
And you didn't think the fact that he has lied on other occasions had any impact on the information he was giving you?
He appeared to be very congruent, very consistent, both internally with what he was telling me and then what I could corroborate from outside sources.
Where was he physically located when you interviewed him?
He was in the, first time was in the attorney's room.
He was in the Los Angeles County Jail, right?
Yes.
Did you think that that might be a motivating factor for why he talked to you?
Objection, Your Honor. Ask him answer.
Overruled.
I'd object also that it's calling for speculation.
Overruled.
Did you consider the fact that he was incarcerated for first-degree capital murder to be a motivator in what he was telling you?
Well, I knew that he was in there for having been involved in the killing of his parents. I knew that.
Well,
And in terms of his motivation to tell me about some of the questions that I asked him, my sense, Erik told me, Erik answered questions I asked about his early childhood.
do you know whether or not he received any psychological treatment in the jail before you interviewed him in March of '92?
I believe Erik had some psychological treatment with Dr. Vickery.
Were you made privy to Dr. Vickery's notes in your evaluation of him?
No, I have not seen Dr. Vickery's notes.
Would you have been interested in seeing Dr. Vickery's notes?
I was more concerned, my job was to evaluate the likelihood that psychological maltreatment of this child had occurred.
Were you interested in knowing what Erik Menendez had told to Dr. Vickery?
About what? About the psychological maltreatment, about his parents' terrorization,
about any of those things?
about any of those things.
Were you interested?
I have not been given the notes. I'm assuming that I know that there's a doctor-patient privilege. So I don't have any of those kinds of notes.
All right, so you were not provided with those notes?
No, I was
correct?
not provided with those notes.
And you did not ask for them?
I did not ask for them.
You were aware of the fact that Dr. Vickery is a psychiatrist?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I believe you indicated that one of the things that you consider to be a component of psychological maltreatment is isolation. And I believe you recounted several specific incidents which you believe tended to show isolating conduct on the part of the parents, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Did you consider the fact that Erik Menendez did have friends when he was growing up?
I knew that Erik had some friends when he was growing up. Yes, I was talking about the kind of psychological isolation that occurred within this household.
All right, but isolation implies that the person is alone, correct?
Isolation implies that psychologically and emotionally they have been isolated, that they're unable to receive the kind of help that they need. And that's what I saw in this case. I saw severe isolation, both within the family and outside the family. I was very struck with the amount of secrecy that this family, and I think particularly Mrs. Menendez, kept. And that I consider to be very significantly isolating.
Well, the secrecy isolated her from other people, correct? Her being a secret keeper and being secretive isolates her from other people.
Well, it also isolates the child from knowing what's going on too.
Now, were you aware of the fact that Erik Menendez was quite close to his cousin, Andy Cano?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
Let me see you at the sidebar just for a moment, Counsel. Just schedule an issue.
Oh.
Okay.
One of the things that you mentioned that you felt was an psychological maltreatment was the fact that Erik Menendez was not allowed to choose his foods that he would eat, correct? I believe you used that term, choice of foods.
That's correct.
Do you think then that children should be allowed to pick which foods they eat? Is that what you're saying?
Well, again,
Let's move that.
I think yes, children should have some choice in what they put in their mouths.
If children want to eat Pop-Tarts and potato chips, do you think the parents should not intervene then?
Oh,
I think
gosh.
this is irrelevant, Ms. Bozanich.
Well, I'm asking the questions. And so unless there's an objection, you're not supposed
Okay,
to.
let's not argue with the witness, and if the witness would just respond
She has definitely gotten under Pam's skin. 100%.
to the question. All right.
Every parent knows that a steady diet of Pop-Tarts and, what did you say, potato chips is not a nutritious diet.
I believe you also indicated that Erik Menendez was not given a choice of what sports to play. Do you remember your testimony in that regard?
Yes.
Do you remember Erik Menendez's testimony that his father gave him a choice between soccer, swimming, and tennis, and that he picked tennis because his brother played it? Do you remember that
He
testimony?
picked tennis because his brother played it. I think that's the significant piece there.
But your testimony was that he was not given a choice of sports.
Objection argument.
Is that a question?
But wasn't it your testimony that he was not given a choice of sports?
Objection argument.
Overruled.
I recall, sports to me means play. Even competitive sports, at least in my growing up, if it wasn't fun, we didn't do it. Sports in Erik's life were not fun. They weren't play. When he was asked, I did see that information that was given to us by the Lewis School just yesterday, and there was something Erik had to write about what is your hobby, I believe it was. Anyway, Erik wrote, I play tennis, but tennis isn't really my hobby. Tennis was Erik's job.
Dr. Tyler, my question to you was, do you remember that he was given a choice of 3 sports?
I don't remember that he was ever, a choice between swimming and soccer. Yes, and I remember that he didn't want to swim because the water would be cold. And I remember a lot of swimming incidents where he was held under to expand his lungs and for periods of time, which I checked off as being abusive. So the kinds of things that happened within those sports were abusive. I don't see that having a choice between swimming and tennis and soccer as being allowed to choose your sport. I didn't have any indication this child was ever asked, what do you want to do? Do you want to hang out after school and have a friend over to play? You want to make a tree house? Do you want to play marbles? Do you want to join a boys club? Do you want to go to Cubs? Do you want to go Boy Scouts? Do you want to go to a movie?
Careful with the talk about boys clubs, because we might start getting into the questions about the billionaire boys club.
I didn't see any of that. I saw, do you want to, play tennis? Do you want to?
Wasn't your testimony that Erik Menendez was not given a choice of sports?
I'm going to object, asked and answered.
It's not been answered.
Objection overruled.
That was your testimony yesterday, was it not, that Erik Menendez was not given a choice of sports? That's
My impression was that Erik was not given a choice of sports, that the sports were chosen for Erik.
And so if he was given a choice between swimming, soccer, and tennis, that was not a choice, correct?
That was not a choice.
Right. And because of that, the parents were abusive, correct?
Because of that one thing. She's gonna remind her, look, I'm talking about an entire pattern of behavior and blah 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 blah.
This, again, is in the context of the kinds of choices they gave this child. You're double bound when you are asked which shirt do you want to wear, the striped or the plaid? And you choose the plaid, and then your mother says to you, so you didn't like the striped shirt. That's not giving a child choices.
I believe you indicated yesterday that in going through the 6 categories of psychological maltreatment, that Mrs. Menendez maltreated Erik Menendez from the age of 0 to 2. And one of the things that you cited, I believe, was the fact that she said, or you had a report that she didn't want to be pregnant. Is that correct?
There's some information from her, from the therapy notes that I have read, Mrs. Menendez therapy notes, that she viewed the boys as getting in her way of relationship with Jose, and that Jose had wanted more children and she hadn't really wanted any children.
But you have no reports from 1969 and 1970 when she was pregnant with Erik Menendez, indicating at that time that she expressed dismay over her pregnancy, correct?
The only reports that I have is that there is a report that during that pregnancy she smoked and she drank alcohol.
Oh.
That's
Well,
the only report that I have
So are you
in terms of
saying,
how she took care of the pregnancy.
so in 1970, was 1970 before or after the Surgeon General's warning on cigarettes? Do you know?
Oh, I'm sure it was before.
So you're saying that because she smoked and drank in 1970 during her pregnancy, you have deduced that she did not want to be pregnant with Erik Menendez.
I'm saying that's all the information that I have regarding her pregnancy. And the other information I had is that she had reported that she had not wanted to have children, that it interfered with her. She had wanted to have a career, I believe, as it was either an actress or maybe a model. Something in that field, and that having the children interfered with her ability to proceed on her own, fulfilling her own course.
Then how was she abusive to Erik Menendez between the ages of 0 and 2 because of that wish?
He was not a wanted child. So he came into that. A lot of people have surprise children, and many people are delighted once they're here. But this child, as we talked about yesterday, was not nurtured in the way that parents nurture their children in terms of holding, caressing, calling pet names, saying I love you, those kinds of things.
Now, you never interviewed the grandmother, did you? And you never saw any interviews from her, did you?
I have not had access to the grandmother's interview.
And she is the only surviving grandparent of this defendant, correct?
I'm going to object to this as irrelevant.
Overall.
She's the only surviving grandparent, correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Well, you've done a fairly complete history of the family. You are aware of the fact that she's the only surviving grandparent.
That's correct.
Okay. Why didn't you ask to either speak to her or have her interviewed?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to that question. It's irrelevant.
Overall.
That information was not made available to me.
Did you ever think you might like to have that information?
If it was available,
Why didn't you ask for it?
But Your Honor, again, I'm going to object. It assumes facts, not in evidence, that there is such information.
Overall.
I didn't know that there was any interview. My understanding is that that grandmother did not wish to be involved in this case. Maybe that's an assumption that's erroneous, but I really don't have any information regarding that.
So you made no effort to either interview her or find out information from her to corroborate your assumptions, correct?
I didn't know how to reach her, and that isn't, I can't do that. I have to rely on the sources that give me the information to give me the information, make people available.
So in other words, your role is merely to receive evidence and not to request evidence. Is
I
that correct?
requested all the evidence that was available.
And if something struck your fancy as something you might like to have, you just ignored it?
Well, Your Honor, I'm going to object to that as argumentative.
Rephrase the question.
During the course of your evaluation, did you ever think it might be nice to interview the grandmother to see if she could shed any light on the information you had?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this given the
prosecution's objection to the intergenerational issue?
Overruled.
Do you remember my question?
You asked if it would be nice.
No, did you ever think to yourself, gee, I'd like to interview the grandmother and see if she could substantiate that Kitty didn't want to have Erik Menendez?
Asked the paternal grandmother if
Ye-
Kitty wanted to have.
Right.
No, I didn't think of that.
Okay. Did you ever think that she might be able to substantiate other claims of abuse within the Menendez family?
Possibly she could,
And why didn't you interview her then?
Your Honor, this
because
has been asked and answered.
Overruled.
she wasn't available to me.
Did you ever call Ms. Abramson up and say, I want to talk to the grandmother? I think it would make my evaluation complete?
No, I did not.
Why not?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this as pure argument.
Overruled.
I've been told that the grandmother does not wish to be involved in this case. That's why she's not involved in the court, I would assume. And she has not testified.
So you decided not to interview her or have her interviewed for that reason, correct?
She was not available to me.
Now, could you explain to me how a child suffers abuse at age 0?
What?
Do you want to go through what we went through yesterday
No, that
in
wasn't
terms
my.
of the nurturance and?
No.
And
Are you saying that because Kitty Menendez didn't want to be pregnant, that feeling while she was pregnant was some sort of child abuse on her unborn fetus? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that was the beginning of a lifetime of rejection, of degrading, of emotional non-responsiveness. That's what I'm saying. That was the beginning of this child's life. And that was all I was saying.
Now, the teachers and the coaches whose interviews you relied on were people who did not see the Menendez brothers inside of the family home. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with that.
All right, the teachers did see the Menendez brothers inside of the home?
You said teachers and coaches, and
Okay. All right, let's
I
break
couldn't
it.
agree with you with coaches because I am aware that there were coaches who were familiar with the Menendez family homes and the Menendez family.
Okay, so there were some tennis coaches who had been inside the home on very discrete occasions, correct?
It's my understanding.
Yes, right. Now, as far as people who lived in the home every day, would you say those people would have a better idea of what went on in the home than people who were occasional visitors?
I'm going to object to this as vague as to time, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Okay. When, let's say the age between 0 and 2, would you say that people who were either lived in the home or involved in babysitting the Menendez brothers would have a better knowledge of what was going on in the home than, well, they didn't have tennis coaches at that time. So wouldn't you say that people who lived in the home while they were children would have a better knowledge of what went on in the home than the tennis coaches who occasionally visited?
Your Honor, I'm going to object again because it got, first it was
All
0
right,
to 2, then it
the objection
got
is
vague.
sustained as to the form of the question. Why don't you restate it?
Most of the information about the in-home abuse that you've cataloged comes from relatives. Would you agree with that?
It comes from Erik and it comes from relatives.
And the coaches and the teachers deal mainly with activities of the Menendez parents outside the home, correct? Mainly.
Yes.
Okay.
And they also made comments, more meaningfully, I think, than that is the comments that they had to make about the demeanor of Jose Menendez and Mary Louise Menendez and how their children were treated. So I think that says significant, that makes a statement about how the kids were treated. They didn't know what was going on behind closed doors.
That's correct.
Nobody, very few people knew about that. That was pretty secret.
And in order to substantiate what goes on behind closed doors, you have to rely on the accuracy of the information you're given, correct?
This has been asked and answered.
Overruled.
Correct?
You have to rely on all the data that you can get.
And in the case of something that goes on behind closed doors, the only data you can get are witnesses who saw what went on behind the closed doors, correct?
Are we getting into
No, You're the one that used the phrase behind closed doors.
Behind closed doors?
Yes.
Secrets, you mean?
I'm saying that when the family was at home and they
Yes.
were conducting themselves as a family, and there were no tennis coaches involved and there were no teachers involved, wouldn't you agree that that's a different situation than how?
Well,
than
you bet. You bet. I think all kinds of things can happen behind closed doors when there aren't outside
Okay.
people seeing what's going on.
And so when you're saying that you've corroborated the information that you got, some of the information you got could not be corroborated by teachers and coaches, correct?
What information are you referring to?
What went on behind?
Really quick. Thank you so much. Debbie Faison Cook gifted 5 Legal Bites memberships. I Love Pie, Arta Rissanen, Christina M, Ooh La La, Diane M. You have all been gifted memberships by Debbie Faison Cook, and immediately followed up by Mountain Princess 207 gifting another 5 Legal Bites memberships to Melanie. Is it Hakwa or Jacqua? I'm sorry. I either way I've mispronounced it. Atea, Deborah Shady, Courtney Baum, and Lisa White. You have all been gifted memberships by Mountain Princess 207. Thank you so much, you guys, for being so kind and generous. That's one of the things that I love about this community is how you guys love to gift memberships to one another. All right. And we've got another like 10, 15 minutes of this testimony left, believe it or not.
The closed doors of the Menendez household.
You know, I'm going to object to this because it's too vague, and I'm not sure which closed doors we're talking about.
All right, it does seem to be a little vague.
Okay. I'm not talking about sexual abuse per se. I'm talking about inter-family interaction. When mom and dad and Erik and Lyle sit down at the dinner table and eat. Okay? Now, when they go to bed at night, when they get up in the morning, I'm talking about family interaction. Okay. Coaches and teachers cannot substantiate those kinds of activities, correct?
You know, this has been asked and answered.
Overall,
Correct?
Coaches and teachers don't live with the family.
That's my point. So, most of the information you got about what went on inside of the Menendez home came from the Menendez brothers.
Objection, Your Honor. There's been other witnesses.
wait, just state your objection. What is it?
All right, misstates the witness's testimony.
Objection overruled.
Do you understand?
I
the question?
heard what went on inside that home from Erik, and I heard what happened inside that home from Lyle, and I also heard other witnesses testify as to what happened inside that home.
And-
Friends and relatives, yes.
Now-
And when you say in the house, do you mean in the bedroom? Do you mean,
No,
what
I
are you
just mean-
talking about?
I think I specified when they ate dinner together, when they got up in the morning and got ready for school, when they went to bed at night.
There were reports from, I think it was one of the female cousins who had stayed there, and she had reported on some incidents, and she had talked about Jose Menendez accusing his wife of poisoning the food, and then got everybody up from the dinner table and took them out to dinner, and whether there had been a problem with her threatening to poison, I couldn't find out from the information that was given me, but I know that there were other people who had talked about dinner and had talked about the ferrets under the bed, and had talked about the disorganization and the chaos and some of the uncleanliness that was in the home. So I am aware of
Dr.
some
Tyler,
of those.
I just asked you a yes or no question, and you answered it with a specific anecdote that you haven't previously relayed to this jury.
Your
Is there a
Honor,
reason that you did that?
Object is argumentative.
Sustained as to the former.
Yep. Yep.
Can you answer the question I just asked you, yes or no?
Objection, argumentative.
Overruled. Do you remember the question? Do you remember the question?
You better repeat it.
You better
My
repeat
question
it.
Do you
was,
remember the question?
well, I'm having a tough time.
You better repeat it. Nice.
I believe the question was that in order to substantiate what went on behind the closed doors of the Menendez house, you had to rely on people who lived in the house. Something to the, yes or no, you had to rely on them.
And others.
All right. Did you ever consider that those people weren't telling you the complete truth?
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Which people are you referring to?
The people that substantiated what went on behind closed doors. That group of people who were not teachers and coaches.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to this because the witnesses testified she did not.
Okay, counsel, you tend to argue your objections and make speeches, so the objection
You
is
tend
what?
to argue your
The
objections and make
objection
speeches.
is it misstates the witness's testimony and assumes facts not in evidence.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
I'm going to go on to something else. I believe you indicated it was your belief that Kitty Menendez did not want to have Erik Menendez. She didn't want to be pregnant with him. Correct? This is foundational. Is that, do you remember that testimony in that regard?
My objection, even if it's found.
Yeah, she's already answered that, so let's
Okay.
get to the ultimate
Yeah.
question here.
Do you remember your testimony that Kitty Menendez wanted a girl?
Yes,
Doesn't that contradict your statement that Kitty Menendez didn't want to have a child?
no, it doesn't,
Okay, why not?
because she didn't want to have children in the first place. And when she got pregnant, she was hoping it was a girl.
But that's not unusual for women, is it?
Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation.
Overall.
It's not unusual for a woman to say, gosh, I'm pregnant, I didn't really want to be, but okay, I hope I have a girl, and to go on and be an okay mother. That's not unusual, is it?
Lots of women are disappointed that maybe they don't get to have a girl or a boy, but it doesn't mean that that they go on to abuse their children.
My question to you is, if Kitty Menendez wanted to have a girl, doesn't that negate your statement that she didn't want to be pregnant?
Objection asked and answered.
Overall,
Argument.
overall.
Kitty Menendez did not want to have children because they interfered with what she wanted to do,
But
to
that's
have a career. When she got pregnant, she wanted to have a girl.
But that's something that you got from a psychological report from
That's
about
correct.
1987, which was 17 years out after Erik Menendez was born, correct?
That's correct. But it was the beginning of this pattern that we've talked about
In
of
1987?
not wanting to have a child, not being able to nurture a child, and seeing the child then as an extension of herself, as someone to fulfill her needs.
Now, the incidences that you've been told about by the coaches and the teachers and everything, and the relatives and the friends, those incidences,
Yes,
did you consider the fact that there were times in the Menendez household when there was no abuse going on at all?
I didn't expect that abuse was going on 24 hours a day.
All right, so would it be your testimony as an expert that they were not abused continually 24 hours a day?
I don't know that.
But
I
you-
only know about the abuse that occurred.
Okay. Do you think it was abusive for Mrs. Menendez to take her children to the I think it was the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City? Was that abusive?
No, that was not abusive.
Was it abusive for the
Not
Menendez?
unless
Here comes Pam finding the 3 hours of their childhood in which they did not abuse their children. Good Lord.
she drove recklessly and terrorized them.
That look.
Do you think it was abusive for Mrs. Menendez to take her children on vacation to the Cayman Islands?
Depending on what happened on that
It
vacation.
depends on whether she was money laundering when she was in the Cayman Islands, right?
Objection, Your Honor, I think that's disrespectful.
Very argumentative.
It's argumentative. Ask her
That
the
too.
question, please.
Dr. Tyler, do you think it was abusive for Kitty Menendez to take her children to the Cayman Islands on vacation? Do you think that was abusive?
I can't answer that with a yes or no. It was not abusive, the fact that she wanted to go on a vacation. It's not abusive, the fact that she took the children on a vacation. That's not, I don't understand
Well-
what else I can say about that.
That
Because I
might,
don't know what happened on that vacation, so I can't expound on that. I mean, I don't know if abuse occurred or not
Well,
on that
don't-
vacation.
well, if abuse had occurred on the vacation, don't you think you would have heard about it by now? Don't you think you would have?
Maybe.
Okay, so can't you assume by the absence of a claim of abuse that that was just a regular
No.
old family vacation?
No. Nope.
Can't-
She can confidently say that. And just why can she confidently say that? Because it often takes a long time for abuse to come out.
Assume that.
All right,
Because as a matter of fact, I think that there's some indication that there was abuse on at least one of those vacations, as a matter of fact. And in terms of the psychological, I
I can't get into that, but I think there was some other kind of abuse.
Did you ever consider that the information given to you by Ms. Abramson was information given to you to paint the parents in the worst possible light?
Your Honor, I'm going to object to the inference of the question that the information came from me. I think that
Rephrase the
misstates
question.
testimony.
Did you ever consider that the information which was given to you by people other than the prosecution was information designed to paint the parents in the worst possible light? Did you ever consider that? That maybe you were getting a very one-sided picture?
I didn't get any other information than what was given to me.
Now, I believe you indicated that that Erik Menendez was not treated as well as his older brother. He was I don't know what words you used.
Second-class citizen?
Okay. Are you aware of the British concept of the heir and the spare?
Your Honor, I think that's irrelevant.
Rephrase the question.
If Erik Menendez was treated as a second-class citizen, he also didn't have the pressure on him to perform that his older brother had, correct?
Erik had a tremendous amount of pressure to perform.
But in comparison to his brother, who was the heir, he didn't have the same kind of pressures, correct?
He may not have had the same kind of pressure, but he had an incredible amount of pressure of a different sort. Both boys were pressured.
Here comes Pam trying to compare them to Prince William and Prince Harry.
Extremely and excessively.
In your evaluation of Erik Menendez, did you ever diagnose him as having a specific psychological disorder or disease?
No, I did not.
And
I was not asked to give a diagnosis. I was not asked to do a complete psychological evaluation. I was not asked to administer tests and do projective testing.
did you ever suspect during the 30 hours that you spent with him and the 1,270 other hours that you spent evaluating this case, did you ever suspect that he had a psychological disorder or disease?
I suspected that Erik was a highly, highly anxious boy. I suspected that Erik had been very depressed. I knew that he had been sad as a child, very sad, and cried a lot and was extremely sensitive. I knew all of those things about him. I never did see a diagnosis of childhood depression, childhood anxiety, and I think it would be interesting to do a workup retrospectively, but I was not asked to do that.
Now, being anxious and sad is not a psychological disorder or disease, correct?
Being anxious and sad, well, it depends on the impairment. Depends on if, a child who is depressed, a child who is suicidal, a child who expresses suicidal ideation is a child in trouble, and a child could be diagnosed with childhood depression.
All right, but being anxious and sad in and of themselves are not a psychological disorder or disease, are they?
In and of themselves, well, anxiety that precludes or impairs a person's ability to function is definitely a disorder because it disables the individual. And depression, which interferes with a child's ability to concentrate and to pay attention and to perform and to function normally, is diagnosable. That's what I'm saying.
But it's not a recognized disorder or disease.
Yes, it is. Childhood depression, childhood anxiety.
So you are of the opinion that he may have suffered from those disorders or diseases. Is that correct? I said may have.
Well, I'm going to object to that as calling for speculation, and she wasn't asked to make that assessment.
Overall.
Erik was a very sad little boy, as described. He cried a lot. Erik had unexplained stomach aches. Erik had nightmares. Erik had a lot of symptoms. Erik would space out. That's a clinical pearl when you see a child who's spacey, who has problems staying with what's going on. And all of these things were brought to my attention vis-a-vis the reports from the teachers who had a lot of concern about this child's emotional makeup. They were very concerned about him. And that's all I can tell you, is that there was concern by people outside of the home about this little boy?
Your Honor, I have still quite a bit more to do. Can we break for the evening?
All right, we'll recess until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, ladies and
All right. Cool. So that is, oh, Kitty, Mabby, what, you don't need to be doing. Okay. All right. Well, she's grooming herself. So, all right. That's the end of the testimony for today. Let me get a few questions before we head out. I am so sorry that I didn't get this one before, Tish. Before we start cross-examination, can you make a short pause and tell us what you expect to see during cross? I'm sorry, that's a little moot because we already just went through a lot of the cross-examination. It's not quite finished yet. And then also from Tish, I hope Legal Bites explains what's going on in the dynamic between Pam and Ann before we go. I'm wondering what Pam is thinking. She's thinking, how can I regain control of this witness? She has completely lost control in this cross-examination and is just steamrolling her with her answers. And the way to sort of get her back is by pulling back your questions to just very tight yes, no questions. And by breaking them down so that they're not such broad, vague questions. Pam was asking a lot of broad, vague questions that sort of required this long-winded response. Or, the Dr. Tyler was able to sort of like add all of this by adding in a lot of context before ultimately giving her question, or giving her answer, I should say. So, the way to sort of retrain the witness is to say, okay, I understand you want to give, extra here, but what I'm asking for is the punchline. What I'm asking for is ultimately, the answer. What's your yes or no answer to this question? Pam was not getting it at all. And Dr. Tyler was just completely just steamrolling her, even adding more context at the end, at the end of an answer when she arguably didn't need to give more, but she got away with a lot. Here's another question. Can PTSD be used as a defense? E.g., can it be used as self-defense or insanity defense? I wonder how a PTSD defense is different from the defense Erik and Lyle are using. Well, they're not using PTSD in the sense of like, someone might use PTSD as to say that like their mind was like they were mentally someplace else in another place at another time. They were reliving a certain moment. And so that would basically get at the culpable mental state, right? That would sort of undermine this idea that they were intentionally doing something or recklessly doing something because they were not even aware of what they were doing because they were living in this moment from this past trauma. That's how that kind of an argument would go. It's tough. There's a lot that you would have to prove for it. Insanity is there are certain very specific elements of insanity to use as a complete defense, meaning that you either you were not perceiving the things around you because of some sort of temporary insanity, or that you were perceiving them but you were misunderstanding them, or you did not understand what was actually happening. You saw that the room was filled with purple elephants, not people, and those purple elephants were coming to get you. You know what I mean? Like there are certain specific things that have to be shown for an insanity defense to be successful. Then we've got, is she allowed to ask whether there's he has a diagnosis, if that wasn't her task, and if she stated that she did not diagnose him. So Pam was able to get as close as she could to that. basically, saying like, did you have a suspicion of, some other sort of diagnosis or what have you? Because, she can only go so far if she says my task was not to diagnose. In order for me to properly diagnose, I would need to do a further analysis. And that was not done here because I was not instructed to do so. So, and you can, that's a proper answer to that kind of a question, because they can't then go out and guess on some kind of a diagnosis. That would be improper. And that would be going outside the scope of either of their expertise or of the analysis that they did. Okay. Another question here. Multiple comments have said that this about the prosecution. They underestimated this case. They thought that they had a slam dunk case. They were disorganized and unprepared. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree, or at least understand why they formed this opinion? Note these statements came from different people. Yeah, I have heard that before. I don't know, because I don't know enough about the background information as to what they knew going into the trial. I would imagine that they would have known. Sorry. I would imagine that they would have known about the allegations of abuse. But I also know that the one little bit that I did see of a documentary about this case before going through all the testimony, and I cut myself off because I was like, no, I want to see this trial myself before I see any documentaries about it. Was I did see something about, Pam Bozanich saying that they went through their opening. They didn't know until they had already delivered their opening statement. And then the defense got up and gave their opening statement. And that's when they found out about the abuse or the abuse argument. I think that's what she said. That was the impression that I had from what she had said during that documentary, which is interesting if that's the case. That would definitely strike me as being underprepared, because normally you've got depositions ahead of time. You've got all kinds of discovery. Sorry. All kinds of different modes of discovery, so that you get what the other side is using as their main defense. I mean, normally you should have a good idea of what they're going to say going into it. So it really shouldn't be this big surprise that they are alleging that they were abused. Let's see here. I think, why doesn't Pam just cut her losses? I don't know. That's a personal judgment. Can't really tell. Based on, okay, let's see. And I think that's all the questions. I am so sorry if, there's one from, let me see here if I can find it. Where is it? Oh yeah, from Debbie Faison Cook. So if she was allowed to opine, why did the speculation objections get sustained? Because they would have been outside the scope of either her expertise or the analysis that she was asked to do. That's where speculation objections would come in. So for example, if she's asked about, like the ultimate legal questions on the case, that's outside the scope of her expertise and outside of like what she's been asked to testify about, what she's been asked to analyze for this case. So, and she's never supposed, no expert is ever supposed to essentially supplant the jury and basically tell them how they should decide. And so any questions about the ultimate legal questions of the case, generally speaking, are going to be considered speculation because they're not legal experts. Okay, probably last question here from Cat Love Dreaming Peach. Didn't Pam say she still thinks they are guilty, like sort of recent? That is my understanding. That's my understanding of what people have said. I don't know. I haven't seen any recent statements by her, but this is what other people have said. Alrighty, folks. So that for me about does it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for to everybody who is watching, whether on replay or live, and thank you for engaging in the chat and in the comments and whatnot. Thanks to the folks that gifted memberships, and to the folks that are new to Bike Club. First off, welcome to Bike Club, or welcome back to Bike Club. On Friday, we've got a members only live stream. So be sure to join us. Same time, 10 o'clock East Coast time. In between, we'll have uploads coming out on other topics and whatnot. So yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you to the mods, as always, for helping to guide discussion, because not everybody agrees on all of these topics. And I love seeing robust disagreement, but that is still respectful. So, okay. Thank you guys so much for joining me once again. And I'll see you guys in the next video.